Chapter 41. It ended up being faster to get to the front doors of the station instead of the employee entrance, so the first person Izuku saw upon walking in was Saito chatting with a civilian. She glanced up, smile wide when she saw him. "Little Midoriya. You made it through the first day without getting stabbed." The woman Saito had been assisting looked around, panicked. "Who got stabbed?" "No one did," Saito exclaimed. "It's worth a celebration." Glancing back, Izuku was glad to see the secretary walking to the desk. "Hey, Watanabe. Do you mind helping this woman finish filling her report? Officer Saito is needed in the back." "Oh, certainly, Detective Midoriya. The others are waiting for you." Calling Saito behind him, Izuku hissed, "You can't just bring up getting stabbed in front of civilians, you'll freak them out." "Well, sue me for being glad you're alive," she said, pouting. It's little Midoriya, and he's not even bleeding," someone else called over the back room. Several people shouted their congratulations, and above them he heard a panicked Takane asking someone, "Is he usually bleeding? Why would he be bleeding?" "It's an inside joke, don't worry about it," Izuku said hastily. "Why don't you join me in Detective Tsukauchi's office?" He looked terrified, even more than usual now that he was in plainclothes, but he followed Izuku into the detective's office without a word. "Good to see you both made it back safely," Naomasa said. "Sit down. Let's hear what you've found." Takane still looked stressed out just to be there, so Izuku started debriefing the two on any important information he discovered, hoping the other officer would relax, at least marginally. One of the groups had been planning a raid on Dead Eyes in a couple of days. "I've warned them off of it, but there's no guarantee that they're actually going to listen to me. It's definitely going to kickstart some sort of conflict with Dead Eyes if it does happen, so I'm going to monitor the situation as closely as possible. As soon as anything happens, I will let both of you know," Izuku said in closing. "We'll distribute this information accordingly, Midoriya, thank you. If conflict does arise, do you have any preference on how it should be handled?" Tsukauchi asked. "This may change based on what Takane says, but we want primarily police personnel. Keep the number of heroes involved minimal, and make sure that they work well together." Izuku steepled his fingers, thinking intently. "We have to work cohesively. Individually, these people aren't terribly dangerous, but you will be facing the as a whole. If you guys aren't unified during this operation, someone will get hurt." "Thank you, Detective. Takane, what do you have for us today?" "I don't have much, and I'm sorry for that. I did successfully infiltrate Dead Eyes, but there is no trust established yet," the officer said, scratching the back of his head. "I'm afraid I won't know anything is in the works until we're actually in the middle of it." "Things rarely go as planned, especially with criminal organizations like this," Izuku promised. "We didn't expect you to become the gang leader overnight, you're doing great. When something is happening, all you have to do is let us know. Both of you are expected to put your lives above the mission. Now get out of here," Tsukauchi said, shooing them out. He met Izuku's eyes, and after all these years, Izuku could tell exactly what he was trying to communicate. Try to calm Takane. "Thank you," the younger two said in unison before standing up. As they left, the officers called out encouragements. "Keep up the good work, boys. Make sure you two don't get stabbed. We're all depending on you." Takane was looking paler by the moment as Izuku hauled him out of the station. "I don't know that I'm cut out for things like this, Midoriya. And why does everyone keep talking about getting stabbed? Is that normal on undercover missions?" "I wouldn't say it's normal, exactly, but my first couple undercover missions were high-stress situations. Just remember, we don't want or need you to be a vital part of Dead Eyes, you're just a background member there to warn us if they're about to make a move. If you can safely bail out at that point, then please do. There's no need to put yourself in danger. We're only stationed where we are to alert the proper channels in time so civilians don't get hurt during the battle." The other man inhaled sharply. "I know that, but I never thought I would be doing something like this, especially so soon out of the police academy. Neither did I, Izuku assured him. If it would make you feel better, you and I will go get dinner, and we'll make a plan as foolproof as we can manage. Deal? After a moment, Takane nodded. Deal. And they did exactly that. It seemed to at least marginally calm Takane, and then it was time for them to go. Izuku had a few precious hours with Eri before it was her bedtime. He would be gone long before she woke up the next morning. As he was tucking her in, her big, crimson eyes met his. You're going to be okay during this mission, right, Deku? I've learned a lot about staying safe since I met you, Eri. As long as everyone else does their job, I'll be just fine, Izuku said, ruffling her hair. Besides, I need to be there for your dance recital, so I have to be okay. You promise you'll be back in time? I pinky promise, Izuku said, offering his pinky. As he locked fingers with her, he internally swore to himself that it would be true. If he had to cause a gang war himself, he would be there for Eri's dance recital. When he left Eri's bedroom, silently closing the door behind him, his mother was waiting in the hallway for him. Do you really think you'll be back in time for her recital? This isn't a small mission, Izuku. I don't intend on breaking any of my promises to Eri. I'll be there, Mom. He smiled, still thrown off by how much taller than her he was, a recent development. This won't be like my first missions. I'm good at what I do, and this is one of my least dangerous missions yet. But I'm being careful. I'm not doing this to prove myself, I just want to protect people. I can't do that if I get myself stabbed or shot, right? Inko looked at him, watery eyes finally overflowing. I'm so proud of you, my darling boy. Thanks, Mom, Izuku said, swallowing back tears of his own. There was a strange sense of finality in the interaction. An unease settled in his chest when he had to slip out of the house early that morning. He couldn't risk being tracked. At the warehouse there was only the night guard awake, as well as the young boy he recognized as the one who'd opened the door for him the first time he'd come. He leaned against the warehouse wall around the corner, out of the guard's view. He was tiny and dirty with a shock of green hair. Izuku had avoided looking at the boy too much for fear of exposing some emotion, but now, with no one to see, Izuku shamelessly stared at him. It was like looking in a mirror, in some ways. Had he not met Detective Tsukauchi, this could have been exactly how he ended up. You, what's your name? Deku asked. Terrified brown eyes snapped up to his face. Sir? I asked you what your name was. Hinata, sir. He swallowed thickly. Hinata Soji. And what exactly do you do around here, Hinata Soji? Nothing. I mean, I just do whatever I'm told to, sir. I don't do anything important. Izuku stared the boy down, easily reading every emotion that crossed the boy's face despite the poor lighting. Why are you here? Well, I couldn't sleep, and sometimes the night watchman needs some. No kid, why did you join Viper Gang? My quirk scares people, sir. Persuasion, right? Don't look so shocked, I analyze quirks for a living. For what it's worth, I think it's a fascinating quirk that has countless uses both for good or evil. If you really wanted to, you could even stop our upcoming fight with dead eyes. Stand tall, the quirk belongs to you, not the other way around. The boy stared at him with a form of reverence. At this point, Izuku had seen that same look on countless people's faces, the look of being introduced to the idea that they may hold value outside of their quirk. Izuku regarded him for a few more moments before saying, I like you, Hinata. If you agree, from now on you're my shadow. You would be my eyes and ears. Anything you hear that I might want to know, you tell me. Snapping into a salute that was almost comical, Hinata said, Yes, sir. Calm down. Just call me Deku, kid. But this is a two-way deal. If you agree, you're under my protection. If you don't want to be somewhere, you walk the other way with my permission. If you don't want to do something, you tell them you're running an errand for me. Deku offered a hand. So are you interested? I'll do it. See ya, Deku. Soji said eagerly, clasping his hand firmly. Thank you, You won't regret this. I'll do everything you could ever want. You're not here to impress me, you're here to help me. And in the meantime, we're going to develop your quirk. It could come in very important to us. You strike me as the kind of kid that doesn't want to end up in the middle of a shootout. That's right, Deku. Well, I don't want one to happen either, but it's going to. Our job is going to be to try and stop it before things get bad. Got it? But why would you want to stop it, sir? Glancing around, it didn't appear there was any sort of surveillance, but Izuku didn't want to risk it. Listen, kid. One day I'll tell you, but for now I need you to trust me without question. I've got my reasons for not wanting this, but I also just don't like senseless death. If you're willing to fight, it should be for some reason better than getting your pride hurt. When he glanced back down, Hinata was staring at him like Izuku himself used to stare at All Might, like he had hung the stars in the sky. It made him feel uncomfortable, but he also remembered being on the other side of things. Unstrapping the katana from his belt, Izuku sat himself down on the ground, leaning against the filthy warehouse. He patted the even filthier ground next to him, the spot Hinata had been sitting in minutes before. If we're both committed to being awake at such an unholy hour, we may as well keep each other company. Yes, Deku sir. Drop the sir, Hinata. Yes, Deku. They sat like that, just talking about Hinata's quirk and how it functioned, and eventually that transitioned into talking about Hinata's life in general. Just having Hinata in his corner was making Izuku feel like he pretty much had everything under control. All in all, Hinata was making for an excellent friend, regardless of how valuable he was to Izuku's cause. When he was able to overcome his nerves, Hinata was whip-smart and he had a fairly good mind for medicine. You wouldn't make a half-bad EMT, Izuku thought out loud, watching the boy almost perfectly mimic the way Izuku had wrapped a sprained ankle. Hinata had officially been his shadow for a week or so at that point, and with his help Izuku had gathered more information than he could have ever dreamed of. Or a first responder. You've got a lot of promise, kid. I kind of wanted to be a doctor when I was a kid. That was before I ran away, though. Izuku let the comment slide, even though he desperately wanted to know more. While Hinata was an open book about most things, he had said nothing about his family or the events that had led him to joining the gang. Until he could actually do something to help, it was best left alone. As it stood, Izuku had sent a picture and name of the boy to Naomasa with strict instructions that he was to be dealt with separately and lightly. If possible, Izuku would cut him a deal and send him back home. As it stood, things were getting tense around the Viper gang. Deku had had to stop a series of people from attempting various raids and preemptive attacks on Dead Eyes, but Viper stood in his corner, even if most of the gang's faith in him was starting to waver. Now that he had a better sense of how things were going to go down, Izuku needed to get things in order. He'd kept to his decision to let Tsukauchi pick which heroes were involved. It kind of chafed at Izuku, not planning the details of the upcoming skirmish, but he had traded some of that certainty and predictability for the situation that would both protect the most civilians and allow the police to capture as many members of both gangs as possible. He only needed another week to get Hinata's quirk strong enough to handle what would be necessary. They might even make it out with little to no casualties, and he wouldn't have an issue making it to Aries' dance recital. Izuku was actually feeling fairly confident about the situation until about 3 days later. It was fairly early morning when Izuku's planning was interrupted by a frantic Hinata bursting into the room. Deku, sir. Hinata and his group are gone. They've already started the raid. Ice filled Izuku's veins, and suddenly the entire world felt off kilter. No, they've been strictly ordered against it. We're not ready. No one has seen them since last night, but it might not be too late. Viper has people looking for them. They wouldn't have gone any of the normal ways, they would be trying to avoid me, Izuku said, moving out the door so frantically that he didn't even grab his katana. What do you want me to do? Izuku paused. What did he want Hinata to do? His quirk was a marvel. He could persuade anyone within earshot to do anything so long as even a tiny part of said person wanted to do what he was persuading them to do. It reminded him a lot of Shinso's quirk, but right now it was unstable. The duration and strength of it was unpredictable, especially under high-stress situations. Scribbling down an address, Izuku finally said, "Go to this police station, specifically this police station. Don't look so scared. I promise they won't arrest you. Tell Detective Tsukauchi that Deku sent you. Stay there, stay safe." He could practically envision which way Hinata had gone. Deku stayed just long enough to make sure Hinata was well on his way before Deku tore through the streets at a breakneck pace. On high alert for anything remotely related to Viper Gang or Dead Eyes, Izuku nearly tripped over a man who was bent over, attempting to pick up the papers scattered over the sidewalk. Agitated, Izuku shuffled the papers into a pile, only barely making eye contact with the man. An unexpected barrage of emotions assaulted Izuku when he realized that this was All Might, his civilian form. He stared at the sunken blue eyes in horror, because his former idol seemed to be the worst omen he could have possibly found. Breathing deeply, Izuku pressed the papers back into All Might's hand. He could see the assumptions in his eyes. The number one hero was assuming he was a hoodlum, or maybe even a villain. Somehow, that knowledge made it easier for him to press the papers into the man's hand and bolt away. It wasn't much farther until Izuku spotted Hinata moving jauntily across the street like he hadn't just sentenced countless people to death. Realizing too late that he didn't have a sword, Deku barreled at the man, shoving him into a nearby alleyway. Ignoring his protests of pain, Deku threw him to the ground, pinning his chest down with a foot. "Are you satisfied now that you've betrayed Viper Gang? I knew you would find me no matter which way I went," Hinata panted, winded from the chase. "But it's too late. You can't poison our gang anymore with your plans. Your fear and hesitation is ruining us and our reputation. You're destroying the Viper Gang." Deku knew the man couldn't see what he was doing with his mouth thanks to the mask he wore, but that was unnecessary. His eyes held the same weight and temperature of a glacier. When he spoke, his voice was as sharp as the katana he'd forgotten. "I may have changed the Viper Gang, but congratulations. You've signed the death certificate." Kit's corner. Izuku probably should have just left things be. He wasn't even on duty that day. It was supposed to be a fun day downtown with Inko and Eri. The weather was perfect and the streets were fairly empty. Because of the empty streets, it made the man and the young girl look even more noticeable. He was a tall man, and he looked like he was playing the part of the distinguished gentleman. His dramatic coat, combined with his companion's theater-esque costume, would make the average onlooker assume they were in some sort of acting troupe. At least, that was what Izuku's mother supposed on seeing them. "Oh my, I wonder what sort of play those two might be part of," Inko said, pointing them out to Eri. "It looks quite fun, whatever it is." Izuku stared at the two with furrowed brows while Eri nodded slowly. "You two go on ahead, I need to check something out." "Is everything okay, Izuku?" "Yeah, Dadku. What's wrong?" "Everything's fine. I just saw someone I thought I might know," he said, practically shoving them into a nearby cafe. Once those two were safe, Izuku jogged to catch up with the other two. "Excuse me, sir, are you gentle criminal?" The two villains, could he really call them that, though? Turned around, smiling brightly. The mustached man smiled charmingly, and asked, "Oh my, are you a fan?" "I've been following you two for a long time. I never miss a video," Izuku said, embracing his inner fanboy. He paused a moment before gasping exaggeratedly and stage whispering, "Are you in the middle of something right now?" "My boy, we can't simply tell you something like that, not even for such an avid fan," Gentle said, patting his head. "But I would be more than happy to leave you with an autograph." "Yes, please. Can I get one from La Brava too? And a picture? I have to tell my friends all about it." Gentle Criminal was one of the low-level criminals that their station had been keeping an eye on. His crimes were minor inconveniences at most, but Izuku doubted that they would stay like that for long. Lately on his vlog he'd been promising some major scheme, and based on how antsy the man and his sidekick were acting, it was likely that they were in the thick of it right then. Well, one picture wouldn't hurt, I suppose, but we really must be on our way, he said, his eyes darting around. Perfect. Say cheese. Izuku said, snapping a selfie of the three of them. Oh shoot, I blinked. Can we redo it? It will only. I hate to disappoint a fan, but we have to get going. I hope you enjoy our next video, he said before using his quirk to soar away. Izuku made a show of tapping away at his phone, sending the picture to Detective Tsukauchi and everyone at the station that was on duty before stepping forward and gingerly testing the elastic portion of the air that Gentle had created just moments ago. He'd spent quite a bit of time studying Gentle's quirk. It was a fun one with a lot of possibilities. It was strange to find a quirk that could give any substance an amazing level of elasticity without affecting said substance at all when the quirk wore off. There were a lot of things that Izuku wouldn't mind studying about the quirk, but his first responsibility was capturing the man. Testing the patch of air, Izuku backed up before giving himself a running start to leap onto the invisible trampoline. It was even more elastic than Izuku had predicted, which left him flailing to where he remembered the next patch of air being. He nearly missed it, which would have been unfortunate on multiple accounts. It took a couple of jumps before he got some semblance of control over them. Embarrassingly enough, what ended up helping him was thinking of Aries' recent fascination with ballet. Mimicking the graceful leaping form, Izuku was swiftly catching up to Gentle, and it was silent enough that they hadn't noticed yet. The elastic patches were rising higher and higher into the sky, and Izuku found himself level with the rooftops of the nearby buildings. He was closing in on Gentle, and now more than ever he had to pay attention to where the man was making these patches so he could potentially overtake him. A flash of movement caught his eye. Right before his foot made contact with the nearest patch, Izuku made eye contact with the hero patrolling nearby. Or rather, the hero's student. Shinso stared at him, completely deadpan before giving him a simple thumbs up. Izuku choked, his foot making contact weird, leaving him careening in the air far farther than he had intended. With a strangled cry, he not only alerted Gentle Criminal and Labrava to his presence, but he fell forward, hands grasping for anything and everything he could to keep himself from falling. His hands did find something, Gentle's coat. Izuku screamed as they both plummeted down, and Gentle couldn't concentrate to use his quirk. Internally, Izuku was preparing himself for all of the lectures he would get for his many broken limbs, but luckily their fall was broken by a nearby tree. Roughly every inch of him was scraped or bruised, but he fared better than Gentle. A branch had knocked him out, leaving him dangling by the coat. Dazed, Izuku barely registered the distressed calls of Labrava. A few minutes later, the tree was surrounded by a number of police cars and fire engines while the firefighters extracted the two of them from the tree. One of the firefighters had a healing quirk that took care of most of his scrapes and bruises, at least the visible ones. He gave his statement before rejoining Inko and Eri, and the only long-term evidences of the event were the continuous court dealings with Gentle, and the video of Izuku leaping like a ballerina that made its way through police officers and pro-heroes alike. Chapter 42. Yanking Hinata to his feet, Izuku let him get his feet under him before grasping the front of his shirt and roughly hauling him down the street, all the way back to the warehouse. Now that Hinata was out of danger, Izuku was feeling strangely calm. Slamming into Viper's office, Deku threw Hinata at her feet. Prepare for all-out war. They did the raid anyway. We have less than an hour. Sweeping out of the room, Izuku wove through the panicked masses that were slowly spreading the news of the upcoming fight. He couldn't bring himself to interact with any of them. Soon enough he'd be acting as a sort of leader. He clenched the burner phone in his hand. A large part of him wanted to run away and never look back. He wanted to have Katsudon with Eri and Mom, and make terrible jokes with the police officers at his station. He wanted to sit in the front row at Eri's dance recital, and see his friend graduate UA. He wanted to prove himself to All Might, and, well, himself. The phone interrupted his wistful thinking, a slight vibration in his hand. It was to Kane, informing Izuku that Dead Eyes were on the way to the warehouse. Tightly shoving down his emotions, Izuku dropped his phone on the floor and crushed it with his heel, grinding it into the concrete. With that done, Izuku slipped fully into his Deku persona, preparing only by tracking down his katana and strapping it securely around his waist. Miles away, Naomasa received a text message from Takane. They'd cut down on contact with Izuku to avoid risking his cover, so they'd been expecting the skirmish any day now. Not thinking anything of it, Naomasa put out the order to have as many cops as possibly on standby to take care of business. It wasn't until a scrawny green-haired boy burst in that concern grew. "I need to see Detective Tsukauchi," he yelled from the reception area. "It's urgent." "Hey, settle down, kid. I'm sure we can figure something out," Nakamura said. "Now what's going on?" "Deku sent me and told me I needed to talk to Detective Tsukauchi," he said desperately. The entire station froze. "Deku sent you?" Nakamura asked slowly. "Yes, and I need to talk to Detective Tsukauchi." Naturally, he was rushed into the detective's office, where every word sent ice through Naomasa's veins. He recognized this child. It was the one Izuku wanted to make sure was protected. He knew Izuku had been thinking about utilizing the boy's quirk to ensure the least amount of violence possible. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. "Thank you. Deku told us about you. We'll take care of you, just sit over there and one of the officers will help you out. If you'll excuse me, I have some phone calls to make." Naomasa barely noticed the boy leave his office, instead taking to pacing. With the new developments, there was no question of whether or not heroes were needed, but who. He remembered everything Izuku had told him, and a number of heroes flashed through his mind, but there was really only one that he trusted enough to take care of things. Picking up the phone, Naomasa dialed the number he knew by heart. Luckily, Toshinori picked up on the first try. "What is it, Tsukauchi?" "We've got a huge fight, Toshinori," Naomasa said, willing his voice not to break. "I've got an undercover detective in the middle of it all, so I need you and whichever heroes you think are best for the job, now. This isn't a job for your students." Before he could let any emotions through, Naomasa hung up the phone, his mind consumed in a single plea. "Please take care of Izuku." Naomasa allowed himself a few moments to collect himself before stepping out into the rest of the station. "Where's Hinata? I need to ask him a few more questions." "We thought he was with you still," Mori said. Tsukauchi swore, bolting out the door, but there was no sign of the boy. "The kid is gone. He probably ran back to help Izuku. This isn't going to end well." "We'll be there to back him up, Detective," Tamakawa said, placing a paw on his shoulder. "It will work out." "I hope you're right," Naomasa said, but even as the words left his lips, the pit in his stomach disagreed. Across Musutafu, Shota was attempting to teach hero theory to his second-year class when Snipe walked in. "Can I help you?" Shota asked. "You're needed for an emergency mission right now. Nezu's already approved it," Snipe explained. "You're meeting up with All Might and Midnight in the courtyard." "Fine. Remember the essay is due tomorrow," he said in parting to his students. Ignoring the collective groans, he soon found himself face to face with All Might. "So what's this mission?" Midnight asked. "There's a gang fight going on between the Viper Gang and Dead Eyes," Yagi said, looking ridiculous wearing his hero costume in his civilian form. "It seems like it's going to be an indiscriminate shootout, but Detective Tsukauchi has an undercover detective in there. That's where we come in." Shota didn't know if he wanted to laugh or scream. It was Midoriya, of course it was Midoriya. He couldn't say anything, of course, because if Shota or the others acted like they recognized him as anything other than Deku, then the whole persona he'd worked so hard for would crumble. Even worse, if Deku was exposed in the middle of a gunfight, there was only one way that things would end. He did find himself unexpectedly grateful that All Might asked him to be a part of the mission. This way he could hopefully make sure that the kid made it to Aries' dance recital. Back at the warehouse, Izuku fully slipped into his Deku persona. Things that he might have hesitated about as Izuku would get him killed, and Izuku had a promise to keep. When the main doors burst open, he didn't startle, but his eyes did widen when Hinata ran in. Several people raised their guns at him, but Deku raised a hand to stop them. "Don't shoot, he's my informant." Viper looked incredibly tense as Hinata scurried to Deku's side. Standing before the entire gang, she proclaimed, "Only one gang is going to leave here today. We started this fight, and we're going to end it, too." While the entirety of the Viper gang cheered, Deku hissed to Hinata, "What are you doing here?" "We had a plan," he said, determined. "I'm not good for much, but I have to try." "You won't be good for anything if you're dead," Deku said. "It's not too late if you get out of here." "I've made up my mind," Hinata said, crossing his arms. "It kind of feels good." "Congratulations, and unless I give you the signal otherwise, stay behind me," he commanded darkly. "I don't want any heroics from you." "Yes, Deku," he squeaked, falling behind as told. A few more minutes passed, and there was still no sign of Dead Eyes. Some of the members were starting to get antsy, but with a look at Deku, Viper shut them up. It was almost endearing how much faith she placed in him. As soon as he noticed it, Deku laid a hand on his katana. "They're here." "Are you nuts?" someone demanded. "No one is here but us fools." "I guess Dead Eyes were too pussy to actually." Deku didn't flinch when a shot rang out, silencing the man forever. There was a ripple across the warehouse, and the illusion they'd all been seeing disappeared without a trace. The space that had previously stood empty was filled with members of the Dead Eyes gang. With a sinking heart, Izuku saw Takane among them. Now he had 2 people to get out alive. But he couldn't focus on that for long. At the head of the gang stood the leader, a man in his 30s with milky white eyes and illusion up his sleeve. No one knew his name. The only name he was known by was shared by the gang he led. You may have one boy with a decent head on his shoulders, but that won't save him. You picked the wrong side of this, Deku. Shouldn't you be addressing Viper? Deku asked as impertinently as he could manage. Or did you bring your entire gang here because I hurt your feelings? We all know Viper is no real leader. Your presence is the only thing that gives this pathetic crew half a right to call themselves a gang. Several Viper gang members protested, lunging forward until Hinata stepped up. None of you want to fight. You all want to leave. Hinata yelled, forcibly spreading his quirk over a larger radius than ever before. An eerie silence fell over the room as everyone in it stilled. Maybe it would all work out. Just as Izuku got his hopes up, they were definitively dashed. Hearing a slight rustle, Deku drew his sword and had to lunge to slice the quill that the porcupine woman on the other side had sent towards Hinata with deadly aim. There were too many people. He specialized in fighting and analyzing small groups. Who were the major fighters? Dead Eyes' illusions were an issue, but the porcupine lady was gripping her gun with a familiarity that made Deku uneasy. There was a man in the back who emitted a barely perceptible electrical hum. It likely interfered with how electrical things functioned. Now was not the time to analyze, though. It was time to fight for his life. Spell broken. Members of both gangs surged forward with battle cries and guns drawn. Using the chaos as his cover, Deku shoved Hinata down and hissed, "Nice try, you almost had him. Now keep low and get out. Kick out the window in the west bathroom, you're small enough to squeeze out." But Deku. Now. He roared, shoving the younger boy away. He watched it long enough to see he'd gotten to the bathroom safely before turning his attention to Takane. Thankfully, the members of Dead Eyes seemed to be fairly well informed about Deku and all of his feats. They likely avoided shooting him out of the hope of recruiting him to their gang, or they'd heard all of the stupid urban legends and they were scared what might happen if they actually shot Deku. The crowd parted for Deku and his katana as he found his way to the very center of the fight where the head of Dead Eyes was baiting Viper. Illusions of him danced all around her, only to disappear when she lunged at them. Your jealousy is truly pathetic to see, Deku said, settling off to the side of the two gang leaders. He held himself like he was at a business luncheon and there weren't bullets singing past his head. You'll have to come to terms with the fact that Dead Eyes is on its last leg. Dead Eyes is on its last leg? The leader demanded. You must be slipping, Deku. You're supposed to be good at this sort of thing. Your actions have doomed your gang, both of your gangs. Deku dodged a bullet by leaning slightly, but with the changed angle, he caught sight of Takane clutching his shoulder amongst the chaos. At the view of red seeping through his fingers, Deku clenched his jaw before continuing. This will be the end for you both if you don't end this. We're in a firefight, and the winner is going to be whoever is left alive at the end. But a handful of wounded people isn't an impressive gang, in my opinion. But since your members' lives are worth so little, carry on. They attacked us first. Dead Eyes snarled. No, a few people disobeyed orders and raided you, Deku said, raising his voice. Viper needs to leash her dogs, but how many times have you raided Viper Gang in the past year? I came because I thought both of your gangs held promise, but you're throwing it all away with your men. And get rid of these illusions, you stopped impressing anyone a while ago. Dead Eyes erased the illusions, pouting a bit as he did. Straightening her shoulders, Viper called, You heard Deku. Let's end this useless killing. The wave of bullets slowed, but there was still gunfire on both sides. When Izuku caught sight of Takane dragging himself to the door, anger flared again. Put your guns down. He roared across the warehouse. People around him froze. This would doubtlessly spawn a whole slew of new Deku stories. He'd never raised his voice as Deku before today. Your leaders are going to negotiate. The next person that fires a gun answers to me, Deku announced. In the meantime, shut up. No one had really been paying attention to anything outside of the fight around them, but Deku had caught the slightest strains of sirens and footsteps outside. Backup was here, he just had to keep everyone in here distracted and unsuspecting. He found himself unexpectedly thankful for Deadeye's big-headedness. He kept arguing with Viper so vehemently that he didn't notice that people on the edge of the room were starting to yawn all at once. When Izuku saw the purple haze pouring out of the vents, he knew he was saved. He couldn't have picked a better ally than Midnight at this moment. He could kiss Detective Tsukauchi. The two leaders were completely focused on each other, and everyone else was so focused on the leaders that Deku could do anything that didn't draw attention to himself. He darted over to where Takane was slumped against the wall, assessing the damage. The man was passed out, and before the leaders could realize what was going on, almost everyone else was passed out with them. Wow, what is this? Dead Eyes demanded, sluggishly shaking his head. People were beginning to panic, but it only served to make them breathe faster, and thus breathe in more of Midnight's quirk. Deku slightly adjusted his mask. It had been upgraded to work as a gas mask about a year ago, but it still looked like an average medical mask. Coldly making eye contact with both leaders, Deku said, the heroes are here. You've just lost both of your gangs. The few people that were awake still looked distressed, but Izuku was just looking forward to leaving this warehouse behind him forever. He began walking towards the front doors, where Takane slumped, but before he could, the doors exploded open. Ice shot through Izuku's veins at the sight of the number one hero barreling through the front doors, proclaiming, I am here. Izuku backed up a few steps, mind whirling. He couldn't be exposed. Most people were asleep, but the air wafting in from All Might's entrance was enough to keep the few people that weren't asleep that way for a while longer. He counted the number of people fighting to stay on their feet, the only ones awake. There were 5, and the porcupine woman had just collapsed, growling softly. Eraserhead and Midnight descended from the vents, taking down the few people that were standing. A job well done, fellow heroes, All Might boomed with a laugh, but Izuku's attention was taken over by the almost indiscernible sound of a gun cocking. Time seemed to slow down once Izuku heard the sound. It would have been the hero's own fault if he got shot, on multiple accounts. But letting that happen to anyone, even All Might, was against everything he stood for, everything he was. Izuku's eyes flew around the room, searching for the culprit before he saw her, a female member of Dead Eyes that had been feigning sleep, but now she was carefully aiming her handgun from where she laid on the floor. Tackling or shoving All Might out of the way wasn't possible in the least. In the end, though, Izuku didn't make a conscious decision. Move! He shouted, before his body chose for him, sprinting to dive in front of the bullet that fired. He'd been shot before, but it couldn't have prepared him for being shot in a vital area. The pain ripped through him, and Izuku immediately lost all strength, collapsing onto the number one hero. He couldn't concentrate on that, though. He had to breathe. Why couldn't he breathe? A cough ripped through his body, the pain rippling through him with every little movement. A small, detached part of his brain started analyzing the situation. He'd just been shot in the lung, which would become very lethal very soon. He was likely going to shock now, and All Might was attempting to staunch the bleeding. What was that gunshot? Izuku knew that voice. It was a good voice, Tsukauchi. His mind wouldn't process the rest of what the detective said, but a part of him relaxed knowing that he could tell at least one person goodbye. "Yeah, stay with me," the detective was saying. Deep breathing. His eyes focused on the familiar face in front of him, a slight distraction from the pain. He wanted to stay, to be with his family and his coworkers for as long as he could. But he couldn't leave them with nothing. Even though every syllable was agony, Izuku forced out, trying to, "Sir." He had to pause to cough, his vision going a little fuzzier. "Just, in case, tell Mom, love her." "Kid, I order you not to die," Tsukauchi demanded, trying to staunch the blood flow even more. Somehow that struck Izuku as funny. You know, always follow orders. It was beginning not to hurt so much, which part of him knew was a bad thing, but the rest of him wanted to chase the numb oblivion. Against his will, his eyes shuddered, and he whispered, "This dream can't die." "Sorry, Eri." Izuku wouldn't say his life flashed before his eyes, but everyone and everything he cared about did. Mom, Eri, every police officer, even Mori, Shoto, his friends. It wasn't fair. His intense longing to be with them longer was the last thing he felt before he was dragged completely into oblivion. Chapter 43. Chaos whirled around the room as Naomasa held his hands over Izuku's wound like it was the only thing keeping him alive, praying that it was actually keeping the boy alive. He wasn't aware of the arrests that were made, or the concern voiced for Midoriya in passing. It was just him and the boy he was begging to stay alive. "Sir. We need you to step aside," an EMT was saying, shaking his shoulder. "Oh. Yes, of course," Naomasa said numbly, falling away from Midoriya. He was fairly sure he knew this EMT from somewhere, but he couldn't place it. While the others strapped a pale Izuku to a stretcher, the first one looked back at the detective, torn. "Sir, would you like to ride on the ambulance with Midoriya? Is he the kid's father?" Another EMT asked. The first one met his eyes before nodding. "Their family. He's losing blood fast. I don't know if he's going to make it to the hospital," another EMT said as they were loading the boy onto the vehicle. "I don't think we're going to be able to make do with just IV fluids, not at this rate." "Do you know what blood type he is?" "Oh, positive," Tsukauchi said without thinking. "Do you or any of your people have type O blood?" "We have everything we need." I don't know," Naomasa said. "I have O negative," a voice behind them said. "I donated last month, and everything checked out just fine. Here's my donor card." Of all people, it was Mori who stepped up. If the stakes weren't so high, Naomasa could have laughed at the concern clear on the officer's face. Instead, he nodded at the officer before climbing in. Seated in the ambulance, Naomasa did his best to rein in his emotions, but he couldn't do that while looking at Izuku. The only alternative he found was staring at his hands painted in the boy's blood. "Can I have something to clean my hands?" I need to make some calls, Naomasa said faintly. Of course, someone said before handing him some kind of antiseptic wipe. Naomasa cleaned his hands as best he could, but he knew that the stains would never leave. Those same useless hands dialed Inko's number, and they trembled as they held the phone up to his ear. Detective Tsukauchi? Could I call you back in a few minutes? I'm just about to. It's an emergency, Inko, he said, voice hoarse. You're going to need to come to the hospital as soon as possible. Izuku's been shot. Her startled gasp nearly broke him, but even worse was her quivering voice. Is he going to be okay? Naomasa closed his eyes. He'd had to tell families bad news before, but it wasn't the same, somehow. A million words ran through his mind, but none of them seemed enough. Language was failing him. They're going to try everything they can, but it doesn't look good. I'm in the ambulance with him now, we just got to the hospital. I'll keep my phone on me and keep you updated until you get here. He hung up in the bustle of unloading Izuku. It was wrong seeing the boy so still and lifeless, but how Naomasa felt about the situation didn't matter at this point. He merely did as he was told, staying as close to the boy as he was allowed. He kept his eyes trained on Midoriya until the second he literally could not anymore. His stomach clenched as the stretcher Izuku was laid out on disappeared behind the doors that led to surgery. He stood and stared at those doors for what felt like an eternity until one of the janitors asked him to move. He had actually been looking for somewhere to sit when a frantic Inko tore through the front door. Where is he, Naomasa? Where's Izuku? She asked, hands choking her purse. Izuku is in surgery right now. Surgery? How badly did he get hurt? Izuku was shot after the heroes and officers arrived on the scene, Naomasa said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It hit his lung, but it also curved at an angle that caused even more damage than it should have. Inko, we need to prepare ourselves for the worst, just in case. He was only able to meet her watery eyes for a moment before she collapsed into him, sobbing into his chest. Why do we let children fight our battles? She demanded through her tears, her grip on his trench coat tightening. Izuku just wanted to protect people, to help them. Why is he here? I don't know, Inko. I don't know. She met his eyes once more, and somehow it was even more devastating this time. How do I tell Eri? How do I tell Shoto? Say the word, and I can have officers bring them here. I can tell them myself if you want me to. They would want to be here. Especially if. This time Naomasa could feel her tears soak through his clothes. He patted her back and murmured, Izuku is a fighter. If anyone can survive this, it's him. But Izuku has been fighting his whole life. What if he just doesn't have any fight left in him? She asked, pulling away and meeting his eyes. Naomasa couldn't find anything to say to that. He could only hold the tiny woman as she cried, that's all there was to do. He couldn't help the young detective stay alive, and he was in no state of mind to go back to the crime scene. For the first time in his life, Naomasa felt completely helpless. Eventually, he was able to guide the distraught woman into a chair near where Mori had soundlessly taken residence. People slowly trickled in, too scared to ask for updates. They merely made eye contact with Naomasa long enough for him to shake his head. Then, without fail, they would collapse into one of the nearby chairs. The officers who had been at the scene and were now relieved were first to arrive. Soma collapsed into the seat on the other side of Inko, while Naomasa sat on the other side of him. Kimura and Tamakawa are going to handle the station, Soma said, any spoken words feeling wrong. Somehow they should be beyond that. Everyone else is going to head over here once they get everything finished over there. Breathing deeply, Naomasa closed his eyes before saying, have Saito and Sasaki go pick Eri and Shoto up from their schools. Yes, sir. Just tell them there's been an accident, Inko interrupted in a frail voice. They should hear it from me. Of course, Soma said before stepping aside to make the necessary phone calls. As more people filed in and silently joined them, Naomasa decided that hospital waiting rooms were some of the most desolate places on Earth. The tasteful decorations and uncomfortable plastic chairs didn't change the fact that someone they cared about was towing the line between life and death. The more people that came in, some Naomasa recognized, some he didn't, the more like it felt there was no room for emotion. Even Inko had stopped crying. How long had they been there? It could have been hours, or only a matter of minutes. Somehow that felt like forbidden knowledge. But at the same time, it didn't matter. Naomasa didn't care what day it was if they still didn't have news about Izuku. Eri got there first, fear in her every movement as she followed Sasaki into the hospital. The little girl had healed a lot after her rescue, but it was clear that anything resembling a medical area still set her off. "Mom?" she asked, releasing Sasaki's hand and crashing into Inko. "What's wrong? Why are we in the hospital?" "Come here, sweetie," Inko said, pulling the little girl into her lap. "Mrs. Midoriya? Are you okay?" "They just told me there was an emergency," Shoto said, stalking his way over to her. While her tears had slowed down a bit, somehow she stopped them altogether. "Listen, kids. There was an accident while Izuku was undercover today, and because of that, he got shot. He's in surgery right now. But he's going to be okay, right?" Eri asked, eyes wide. "The doctors are going to make him all better. They're going to try their best," Inko said with a sad smile. "But Izuku was hurt really badly. They don't know if they can help him or not." "How did this happen?" Shoto demanded. "I don't know," Inko said, her voice cracking. "We would have to ask the heroes that were there. They were the only ones who saw anything. I'm afraid I'm really the only one who could tell you." All eyes, including Naomasa's, landed on the tall form of All Might. He was still in his hero costume, and the streaks of blood across it made the detective's stomach turn. For the first time in years, All Might seemed uncertain, awkward. He fidgeted a bit, before saying, "I was standing closest to the boy when he took the bullet for me." Naomasa stared at Toshinori in horror as the hero hung his head in shame. Surely he heard that wrong. He couldn't. All Might was the #1 hero. Would he even be hurt by a bullet? "Excuse me, sir, but what?" Shoto asked. "Ah, young Todoroki. I didn't see you there. You see, I entered the warehouse a bit prematurely, and not everyone was asleep from midnight's quirk. There was, so much noise that I didn't hear the gun being cocked, but apparently young Midoriya did. He threw himself in front of me just before the bullet hit, and, well, here we are, Mrs. Midoriya." "I genuinely apologize for my error," the hero said, bowing even lower in penance. A crack sounded across the waiting room, and it took Naomasa an embarrassingly long time to realize what had just happened. Inko had just slapped the symbol of peace. She stood before him as a completely different woman, eyes bright with anger instead of tears, chest heaving with emotion. Standing abruptly, Soma took Eri by the hand. "Your mother probably needs something to drink. But we'll get you a treat too. Come on, I need help picking out the best one for your mom." As soon as Eri was out of earshot, Naomasa turned to the tiny woman. "Inko, I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but All Might was just trying his best." "Was he trying his best when he told Izuku he couldn't be a hero?" "When he what? Excuse me?" Every officer, every person, in the vicinity hung off of Inko's every word as hot, angry tears coursed down her cheeks. But Inko only cared about the blonde man who stood in front of him. "I understand that you probably don't even remember him, but he idolized you. My baby wanted to be a hero just like you, and he wouldn't let anyone tell him no, not his teachers, not his supposed friends, not even me," she said, her voice fracturing on the last word. "He never gave up until the day that the sludge villain attacked, and it was like the villain had really killed him off. I was so scared he would actually, well, after that day he got rid of all of his All Might merchandise, and some of those things he loved more than life itself at one point. He's just a boy. How much more are you going to take from him?" The hero worked his mouth open and closed a few times before a familiar hand touched his shoulder. Aizawa. I'll give you updates on the kid. This might not be the best place for you to be right now. Sit back down, Inko, I'll be right back. I'm going to walk All Might out, Naomasa said, directing her back to her chair. The woman collapsed into it, spent from her bout of anger. Then he walked along with All Might long enough that they could duck into somewhere private enough for the man to transform. Thanks for the help in there. I really just wanted an update on the boy before I went back to school. I don't have enough to teach, so. Detective. What? You called him a boy just now, but Midoriya is a detective, Naomasa said a bit rigidly. Oh, my apologies. He seems like a good one. Why did you tell him he couldn't be a hero? Naomasa asked, searching his friend's face. I'm just trying to fathom what you could have said to leave him as unsure of himself as I found him. Well, the boy is quirkless, isn't he? Toshi asked hesitantly. And? Your point? Naomasa, you can't tell me that you would encourage a quirkless teenager to become a hero. It would be far too dangerous, even if he did get into a hero course by some miracle, Toshinori said, eyebrows furrowed. What would you have had me say? Am I really hearing this? You, Yagi Toshinori, were born quirkless. If anyone should be a quirkless advocate, it's you. I don't expect you to understand what being quirkless is like. Apparently I shouldn't have expected you to, either, Naomasa spat, a little unsettled by the rage he felt. What really happened in there with that gunshot? Toshinori closed his eyes, already regretting what he was going to say. Back during the sludge villain incident, Midoriya saw my civilian form. I told him a bit about my fight with All for One and showed him my wound. Naomasa clenched his hands into fists as every word rang true. He couldn't bring himself to respond just yet, not until Toshi finished. The gunshot would have hit the wounded area, and at that point it wouldn't matter if my suit was bulletproof or not. An impact like that would have caused internal bleeding that could have been a death sentence. Somehow knowing what happened only made Naomasa feel worse. It's time for you to leave. What? Naomasa, we can't. He held up a hand, cutting the hero off. I can't talk to you right now. Just go, Toshi. You've done enough. Wait, Naomasa. Let me explain. Toshinori started, but Naomasa was already walking away from his friend. In the hallway he had to take a moment to calm down before he made his way back to the waiting room. His seat next to Inko was waiting for him, and he took it wordlessly. Izuku is out of surgery, Shoto informed him in the same monotone voice as normal, but Naomasa could see the emotions boiling in the boy. They'll be monitoring him closely, but the doctor should be out shortly to give an update. Aries sat on Inko's lap, fidgeting with the drink Soma had bought her. Mom? Yes, sweetheart? Would my quirk help Deku? Inko bit her lip. Yes, Aries, it might be able to help. But it might also hurt Izuku. That's why people who use their quirks in their jobs have to train for a long, long time. Besides, Izuku wouldn't want you to try if you're scared. He already has a lot of people doing everything they can to take care of him. Oh. Okay, she said, going back to fiddling with her drink. They waited a while longer, quietly murmuring to one another when a frazzled-looking doctor stepped into the waiting area. I'm looking for the family of Midoriya Izuku. As one, almost the entire room stood, including an anxious blonde girl Naomasa had never seen before. Yachi, we're here for your brother, not whoever, that is, her mother hissed, pulling her down. So many people are here for him, I'm curious, the girl complained. Blinking at the mass of people, the doctor asked, You're all here for Midoriya Izuku? I'm his mother, Inko said, pushing forward. How is he? The operation was successful as far as retrieving the bullet and repairing what internal bleeding we could. But I'm afraid your son is still in critical condition. It's a complicated injury that could reopen on its own and cause more damage at the slightest movement, even with quirks helping along the healing process. So what can we do? Inko asked desperately. We recommend putting him in a medically induced coma. There are things we can do to help along the healing process that we can't do otherwise. After a few days, he should be stable enough to wake up and begin a more traditional healing approach. Absolutely, I'll let you do whatever you may. Mrs. Midoriya, before you make any hasty decisions, I'm obligated to tell you all of the drawbacks, the doctor said with an uncomfortable gravity. While I do believe that the medically induced coma would genuinely be the best path to take, it is still nothing more than a Hail Mary. Your son flatlined several times throughout the surgery. If he hadn't had the blood transfusion on the way to the hospital, he likely wouldn't have made it to surgery. As we speak, he's being rigorously monitored. The odds are not high for your son, Mrs. Midoriya. What are you saying? I'm saying that if we put your son into a coma, there's a chance he'll never wake up again. Chapter 44. Hitoshi had been feeling uneasy all day. It started when All Might was pulled out of their heroics exercise, but it persisted. He wasn't sure why today was so bad, and he knew that Nezu wouldn't give him any answers, even if he managed to brainwash the rat, but the feeling only increased as the day went on. Everyone was obviously feeling antsy, but Hitoshi's stomach plummeted when a police officer appeared in their classroom doorway around 2 hours later. He recognized this one from Izuku's police station. I'm here to collect Todoroki Shoto, the officer said grimly, a stark contrast to her usual playful disposition. Is everything okay, officer? Ectoplasm asked. There's a family emergency, that's all I'm authorized to say, she said seriously. Has Endeavor been in a really bad fight or something? Kaminari whispered. Todoroki was emancipated, Hagakure gently reminded him. Oh, right. While the class speculated, Hitoshi couldn't help but listen to Ojiro when he leaned over to Todoroki as he was packing his things. I don't know what's going on, but could you update us on what's going on? As long as you're comfortable with it, I mean, the blonde said, forehead creasing in concern. And by us, he means the other honorary Midoriyas, Hitoshi added, feeling more awake than he had in weeks. Todoroki nodded once before disappearing with the police officer. It felt like an eternity until he heard the nearly indiscernible buzz of Ojiro's phone. Even though he was generally a rule follower, he slipped his phone out of his pocket. Sitting where he was, Hitoshi had a fairly decent view of his face, and his stomach tied in knots when he visibly paled. He didn't take a single note the rest of the lesson, merely staring at his desk, his tail flicking back and forth in agitation. Lunch was immediately after that class, so while everyone else fought their way to the cafeteria, the concerned parties crowded Ojiro's desk. What did Todoroki say? Shinso demanded. While he was undercover today, Midoriya was shot, Ojiro said, his voice strangely empty, looking at his phone as if he were willing the message to be different. He's currently in surgery and they don't know whether or not he's going to survive. A shiver ran down Hitoshi's spine at the words, and he could feel his carefully constructed mask fracturing. Are they sure it was Midoriya that got shot? He's meticulous, he wouldn't do anything that might make him miss the dance recital. Detective Tsukauchi went in the ambulance with Midoriya, Ojiro said. A wild sound broke free of Uraraka, and Hitoshi couldn't stop himself from stepping away and cursing loudly and colorfully. As the words seemed to erupt out of him, not even Iida tried to censure him. The other boy looked like he felt similarly. Disbelief was his instinctive reaction, but as much as he tried to will it out of being, Hitoshi couldn't deny the sinking dread. Several days later. Are you sure you don't want to go see Izuku? Mama Inko asked again. She wasn't crying at this point, but Eri could tell that she wanted to. Lately Mama Inko was crying way more than normal, but Eri wasn't much better. She had cried a lot every time Deku had left for any undercover mission. She knew he had to go help people the way he had helped her, but she always remembered how badly he had gotten hurt then, and it really scared her. Now was even scarier than before Eri had been rescued. The first 2 days she wasn't even allowed to see him, no one was. They tried to keep her from hearing what was going on, but she knew that his heart stopped beating more than once during the first 2 days. When he was finally stable enough, they let 2 people go in to see him at a time. Shoto let her go in first with Mama Inko. She knew that Dadku wasn't going to be awake, but she wasn't prepared for what she saw. Eri had never fully gotten over her fear of hospital environments, but nothing could have prepared her to see Dadku like that. There were monitors beeping that let them know that he was still alive, but what she saw scared Eri to no end. She thought he would just look like he was sleeping, but death would have been more peaceful. Dadku was paler than she'd ever seen him, and he looked too skinny. Wires and tubes were everywhere, making him look like he had a scary quirk. Eri couldn't bring herself to look at his tummy, because she was too scared of what she might see. Shaking her head, she turned her attention back to Mama Inko. No, I want to stay home since Shoto is going to be here. Mama Inko tried to smile before pressing a kiss to Eri's forehead. Be good for him. I will. The door closed behind Inko and she could hear Shoto flipping through a textbook. This would probably be her only chance. I'm going to play in my room, she called, moving forward when she heard Shoto's faint sound of affirmation. In her room she made a beeline to her window, or more specifically, the plants lining the windowsill. She'd started collecting plants to take care of after the first one Dadku had given her when he was undercover. They were good to practice her quirk on, but they were also just fun to have and take care of. She knew plants and humans were really different, but it was Eri's only option. One of her plants had just started getting a new leaf 2 days before Dadku got shot. If she could rewind it until that one leaf was gone, no more, no less, then maybe she could rewind Dadku like he never got shot in the first place. Ignoring the way that her hands were shaking, Eri let the feeling of her quirk take over. Her body tingled while the light that still scared her a little bit washed over her surroundings, and she carefully tapped one of the leaves with a fingertip. Slowly the new leaf curled in on itself, tucking neatly into the bud it had started as. Eri's chest started thrumming with hope as she clamped down on her quirk, willing it to stop as soon as the leaf was gone with no evidence it had ever existed. Closing her eyes, she tried to remember everything Dadku had taught her about shutting her quirk off. She pictured pulling the light away from the plant and back into herself. Eri felt her face scrunch up in concentration as she tried to keep a steady pressure. She was almost there when the last of her quirk exploded out of her. The tingle faded, and Eri hesitantly opened her eyes. In front of her sat a pot filled with nothing but dirt. There was a chance that a seed in the dirt, but there was also a good chance that she'd just erased it from existence. Her hands were still shaking when she set the flower pot onto the windowsill, hot tears coursing down her cheeks. She couldn't keep in her tears, couldn't bring herself to cry silently like she'd had to with the Shi Hasaikai. Eri let herself cry, and Shoto heard. It was only a matter of seconds before he burst into her room, searching around like there was some sort of threat. Are you okay, Eri? I wanted to help Dadku, she sobbed, careless that he would figure out that she used her quirk without permission. I wanted to use my quirk for something good, but I would only hurt him. The girl didn't see the sheer panic in her adopted brother's eyes, but he did attempt to console the child with stiff pats on the back as she cried into his chest. There are other ways we can help Izuku, he said hesitantly. Shoto had slowly developed a relationship with Eri, but this was the sort of talk that always involved Izuku or Inko. In fact, Shoto could have used a pep talk himself at the moment. How? Eri asked, sniffling. Racking his brain, Shoto said, we can be nice and thankful? Yeah, just like Mama Inko is always saying, we need to tell people thank you. Shoto worried that the child would only begin crying again, or call him out as the fake adult that he was, but Eri thought deeply and nodded. I never said thank you to the officer that gave up his blood. Dadku would want us to say thanks. Exactly, Shoto said, nodding as if she had come to the conclusion he'd intended all along. We could go right now and say thank you. Wait, give me a little time, she said, pushing the hero student out of her room. You're not allowed to use your quirk alone, he warned. I won't, I promise. I need to make something. Shrugging, Shoto returned to his homework. 15 minutes and several math problems later, Eri emerged with a mess of ribbon and glitter attached to a safety pin. Now I'm ready. Part of Shoto wanted to ask about the creation, but he ultimately decided that he would find out what that was about eventually. Okay, let's head to the hospital. The trip to the hospital was a largely silent one, but that was usually the case when Shoto and Eri were alone together. It was a comfortable silence, and occasionally a devious silence. When they arrived at the hospital, he simply trailed behind the girl as she skipped through the crowd of police officers to find her target. Officer Mori? She said, tugging on the back of his shirt. He looked slightly annoyed as he turned around, but as is the natural response, it completely subsided when he saw Eri. Yes? Thank you for giving up your blood for Deku. That was really scary and brave people should get a medal, she said, holding up the pin. The officer in question, who Shoto had always found to be a rather disagreeable man, looked stunned. That's for me? I mean, I know it's not a real medal, Eri said, wilting a little. If you don't want it. Nope, it's mine forever, kid, Mori said, snatching it from her. Dropping his voice to a whisper, he continued, don't tell anyone, but I would be sad if your brother wasn't there to annoy me. But he'll be okay, he's got some of my blood in him now. So you think he'll wake up? She asked in a tremulous voice. Even if I don't use my quirk? My blood is strong, it just takes time, he said, waving her concerns away. Don't waste your quirk, it's already taken care of. Mori Akito had always hated hospitals. He'd never had any traumatic experience with them, he just felt stifled. He hated the sterile smell and the fluorescent lights and the general ambience of despair. But since joining the police force, he hated visiting his coworkers most of all. It wasn't a frequent occurrence. Saito and Sasaki had forced him to go visit Kimura when she'd had her baby a few years ago. While he was going through the academy, one of the rookies accidentally shot themselves and their classmates goaded him into going. He'd been forced to visit Midoriya every time he'd landed in the hospital, because even douchebags are expected to show up. He was comfortable in the douchebag category. Mori didn't want to move into full-blown asshole. But this was different. He'd never felt this frantic despair and been so helpless before. It was strange. Most of the time he couldn't stand Midoriya and the way everyone doted on him. However, the second he'd heard what happened, he was ready to drop anything. He'd even given the brat some of his blood. As if the universe was attempting to punish him for thinking ill of the dying boy. Because of course the universe adored him too. Saito appeared out of nowhere and looped her arm through his, violently pulling him away from the vending machine he'd been staring at. The puncture where the EMT had stabbed him 5 times began throbbing with a vengeance, and Mori ripped his arm from hers. Don't touch me. You're a better man than we took you for, Mori. Not necessarily a good man, but better than we thought, she said, though it lacked the punch her quips usually held. Attempting to rally, she continued, although that blood was the best part of you, so maybe you're just as terrible as we thought. Still jealous that Eri made me a medal and not you? Settle down, both of you, Nakamura interrupted, easily parting the two of them. Saito, stop antagonizing him or come up with new jokes. You've been using the same lines for the past 3 days. So are you two here just to cause me more pain, or, Mori interrupted. You've been standing in front of the vending machine for an hour, Nakamura said. We figured you needed some direction. Glancing at his watch, Mori cursed, realizing it was true. I couldn't decide what to get. His vitals are stable, and if they stay that way they're going to let people other than his family see him, Nakamura said as an obvious attempt to calm him. And it's probably not going to be until tomorrow at least. They tried to be optimistic like that the first 2 days and then he flatlined twice, Mori spat. It's been 3 days of wallowing around the hospital in despair. Ah, you do care, Saito cooed. The sheer number of people is ridiculous, he said sourly. We've got half of Japan's police force and pro-heroes in the waiting room, not to mention all of his other little friends popping out of the woodwork. And you're worried. I just don't need my day ruined by everyone crying, Mori huffed, turning back to the waiting area. Which you're worried about? Don't worry, I won't, Saito cut off, her eyes narrowing. I can't believe he actually showed up again. Who? Mori asked, beginning to scan the room before his eyes found a massive yellow eyesore. All Might was edging towards the crowd of people that were constantly gathered in the hospital waiting room. A weary nurse stood at the head of a line that wove throughout the entirety of the room, glaring at whoever was in line. And how are you related to Midoriya? We're cousins. Very close cousins, Sasaki said, wings fluttering a bit as she did her best to look angelic. Unimpressed, the nurse said, last time you said you were his stepsister, and the time before that you said. Oh, can't you remember your own family? Detective Kimura cut in with a nervous laugh. At the behest of Saito and Sasaki, Watanabe had been forced to construct some stupid family tree so that the entire station could claim to be related to the Midoriyas and go visit him, especially when Inko had to be at work. Since he'd stabilized enough for visitors, Midoriya hadn't been alone once during visiting hours. Mori had visited a time or two, but both times he'd gotten yelled at for giving Midoriya a mustache with permanent marker. If Saito had done it, everyone would have thought it was funny, but no. When he did it, everyone got pissed at him and regularly frisked him for writing utensils. But seeing the symbol of peace moving towards that line set Mori off. With all the authority that being Midoriya's fake second cousin 3 times removed gave him, Akito marched over to the man and demanded, "Can I help you?" Startling, the man looked down at Mori. "Yes, I heard that the boy can have visitors now. First of all, he's Detective Midoriya to you, you piece up." Nakamura slapped a hand over Saito's mouth, although he was glaring just as venomously at All Might as the others. Nakamura opened his mouth to say something, but Mori beat him to it. Visitors are family only. Glancing at the eclectic group of people in line, the hero's eyebrows furrowed. Surely there are some exceptions. With a yelp, Nakamura withdrew his hand. The fool had forgotten that Saito was a biter. Released, the feral woman got right into the number 1 hero's face. There aren't exceptions for you, you dream-crushing, spandex-wearing. Calling the woman back by the collar of her shirt, Mori said, "Aren't we supposed to have some semblance of dignity?" "And you," he said, leveling his gaze at All Might, "we belong here." "You don't. Family. Only." Days passed and Midoriya still hadn't woken up. Ochako and a number of other students made sure to visit him every day after school. He'd been stable enough that he was allowed a handful of visitors at a time, and they didn't have to claim to be related to him. It made life immensely easier for the poor nurses. She didn't make it into his room every day, but she'd gone to the hospital every day since they'd gotten the news. There were updates daily, but it all boiled down to the same answers. It was impossible to know when or if he would wake up. That Saturday, Ochako was the only one able to go at the time. Most of the boys had promised to go to Aries' dance recital as Midoriya's proxies. She happily would have gone as well, but she had only really met the girl a handful of times. On top of that, yesterday she had been confronted by a tearful Midoriya Inko. "Will you stay with him tomorrow?" she had begged, clasping one of Ochako's hands in both of hers. "He hasn't been alone during visiting hours, and I hate the thought of him waking up without a friendly face around." "Of course I'll stay with him, Mrs. Midoriya," she had said. What else could she have said to the woman? Sahir Ochako stood, waiting for the nurse to give her the okay to go into his room. Glancing at her clipboard, the nurse said, "This must be some important dance recital." "I didn't think anything short of a miracle could get that group of nuisances out of our lobby." "Oh, they'll be back tomorrow," Ochako assured her. "Go on in," the nurse said, mood slightly soured. "It'll probably be the most peace the boys had in a while." Thanking the nurse, Ochako slipped into the eerily silent room. She was used to being one of many visitors clamoring to see Midoriya and causing general chaos. But now the only sounds were the various monitors hooked up to him and the almost indiscernible sound of his breathing. They'd removed a number of the tubes and wires since she'd seen him last. Some of the color had come back to his face, and he was starting to look less dead. She had heard that a number of healing specialists had seen him, recovery girl included. They had healed him as much as they safely could, but it wouldn't take much for the wound to reopen. Once the nurse had left, Ochako pulled a glove from her pocket and onto her hand. Settling into the chair that Mrs. Midoriya usually occupied, after a moment of hesitation she reached out to his hand, slipping hers inside. She could feel the warmth of his hand through the glove, but it was nothing compared to the heat crawling up her face. She tried to will the blush away, but to no avail. After a few moments of listening to the monitors, she gathered herself enough to speak. "You know you have a lot of people waiting for you, Midoriya," she said, her voice rough with unshed tears. "It's pretty impressive. The hospital had to organize a completely new system of allowing visitors in just for you." A small part of her had almost expected to hear him reply to her, so it hurt that much more when she was only heard the continued beeping of the monitors. The sound was so disheartening that her composure cracked and a few tears escaped. "I understand why we waited," she said, barely more than a whisper. "But since the second I heard you got shot, I've regretted it. Even if we were just friends, I want to know more about you, spend more time with you. I want to see your smile and the way your eyes light up when you talk about quirks. I want you to be happy, and to go to Aries' dance recital." At that moment Ochako could have sworn that Midoriya's hand twitched in hers. It was probably all in her head, though, it had to be. She sat attempting to wipe her tears with her free hand when she felt his hand twitch again. Eyes widening, her heart stuttered in her chest. She stared at the unconscious boy for a moment before scrambling to find the call button on his bed. It wasn't even a full minute before 3 nurses and a doctor burst into the room, each exhibiting varying levels of panic. "What happened? Did his vitals drop? Is he still breathing?" "His hand just twitched in mine," Ochako said, feeling flustered. "Twice. I think he might be waking up." "Oh honey," one of the nurses said with a pitying look, "it's probably just a muscle spasm. That happens sometimes, it's best not to get your hopes up. While we're here, we can check." Once again Midoriya's hand tightened around Ochako's, and he actually mumbled something. It was completely unintelligible, but it was definitely coming from him. The nurses stared at him with wide eyes and the doctor lurched forward, checking charts and monitors. Ochako couldn't tear her eyes away from Midoriya. She almost couldn't bring herself to even blink for fear that it would change something. She could have sworn that her heart stilled as he kept attempting to say something. The monitors picked up their pace, but that was nothing compared to the sight of Midoriya Izuku's eyelids fluttering open. His green eyes were as clear as ever, and Ochako felt like they were staring into her very soul. He mumbled a few more times before clearing his throat and asking in a clear voice, "Have I missed Aries' recital?" Chapter 45. Hinata paced in the waiting room, heavily debating with himself. The waiting room was almost completely empty, which hadn't been the case since Deku Midoriya had been shot. He knew the police had been looking for him since that day, but almost his entire life had been spent running from heroes and police officers, and who knew what they would do to him if Midoriya wasn't there for him. There wasn't a police officer in sight. It made Hinata feel a little twitchy, like he was in a haunted house waiting for his worst nightmares to jump out at him at any second. But when he saw Mrs. Midoriya leave, Hinata knew this would probably be his only chance to see Midoriya without being arrested. He knew exactly what Midoriya was in. Hinata stalked through the hallways quickly and doing his best to seem like he belonged there. He had made it into the hallway that Midoriya's room was in when an alarm sounded and a handful of people rushed around, hastily grabbing medical equipment and rushing into Midoriya's room. Breaking into a sprint, Hinata rushed down the hallway, skidding to a halt just before the doorway. The medical personnel were clustered around his bed, blocking Hinata's view and talking over each other. Something happened to make them all gasp and fall silent, and a single voice asked, "Have I missed Aries' recital?" At the sound of Midoriya's voice, Hinata froze. He felt like he couldn't breathe, couldn't blink, couldn't move in the least. Could that really be Midoriya and not some cruel trick of his mind? Without thinking, Hinata pushed his way into the room. Midoriya was sitting up in bed, pale but clearly arguing with the surrounding medical professionals. "You just woke up from a coma after a nearly fatal gunshot," one of the nurses said, clenching her fists so she didn't shake the detective. "You can't leave the hospital." "It's a dance recital, not a rave," Izuku said, glaring at the wires that seemed to be everywhere on his body. "I can tell I've been in a coma long enough that I'm stable. Clearly I can sit up without bleeding out. You can strap me into a wheelchair, or even take the entire hospital bed. But I promised Eri that I would be there." "You just woke up, Midoriya," Uraraka said, forehead creased in concern. "Everyone would understand. They would be thrilled that you're awake. A lot of people are recording it for you." "I promised," Izuku said, his voice cracking the slightest bit. "And we promised to keep you alive," one of the nurses argued. Seeing the defeated look on Midoriya's face, Hinata mustered what little courage was coursing through his body and he spoke. "You're going to find a way for Midoriya to go," Hinata said, forcefully layering his voice with his quirk. "You'll find someone to come with him to make sure that he's fine, but he's going." The vacant look in their eyes was familiar to Hinata, but he didn't expect Midoriya's eyes to immediately snap to his face. "Hinata. You're here. You're okay." The outburst surprised Hinata enough that he almost lost control of the room's occupants. "You can resist this?" "Oh, didn't I tell you about this during your training? One of my best friends has a mind control quirk similar to yours. I've done a lot of training with him, and I've done a lot of training with him, so I can usually resist it, especially when I'm not the primary target of your quirk. I have a lot of questions for you, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions for me, but right now I have a recital to get to." Izuku gingerly lifted his hospital gown, examining his gauze-covered torso. Poking it lightly, he said, "I should be safe to go in a wheelchair if we're really careful. Can you release Uraraka from your quirk? She can help us do this safely, but she needs to be cognitively aware." Sure," Hinata stammered. Shortly afterwards, Uraraka stumbled a bit, blinking. While she was trying to regain her bearings, the brainwashed medical professionals were moving around, slowly unhooding Izuku from all of the wires and monitors. Furrowing her eyebrows, Uraraka asked, "What's going on? Why are they unhooking you?" "I promised Eri I would make it to her recital. I'm not letting her down now," Izuku said before stopping a nurse from taking out his IV. "Let's leave that in. We can take the IV pole with us." The nurse blankly nodded and moved on to the oxygen monitor on his finger. As soon as she removed it completely, a shrieking alarm shattered the relative silence. Izuku jolted, which only hurt a little bit thanks to the heavy painkillers he was no doubt on. It jolted the others as well. In the case of the nurses and doctor, the alarm jolted them out of the grasp of Hinata's quirk. Chaos ensued, and Izuku's muddled mind couldn't process what was being shouted over the screech of the alarm. He blinked, each time keeping his eyes shut slightly longer than the last to shut out the fluorescent lights, the mass of people pouring into his room. Enough. One voice roared above the others, swiftly followed by the sharp cutoff of the alarm. When Izuku opened his eyes again, he found Recovery Girl parting the crowd with her cane. "The main doctor and nurse can stay. Everyone else get out." But now, Izuku watched as everyone slowly filed out, the end brought up by Uraraka and Hinata. Before they could step out, though, Recovery Girl said, "You too, stay." They complied, largely out of fear of what might happen otherwise. While Uraraka and Hinata pressed up against the wall and tried to will themselves into invisibility, Recovery Girl and the doctor moved around Izuku, checking vitals. "Care to explain what you thought you were trying to do just now, Midoriya?" Recovery Girl asked, staring him down. Aries' dance recital is happening as we speak. And you were willing to bleed out for that? As long as I don't move too much I'll be fine, Izuku said firmly. It's not ideal, but it's doable, and it's a risk I'm willing to take. I promised her that I would be there. The two made unflinching eye contact for such an extended period of time that everyone else started to get antsy. Recovery Girl broke first, nodding slightly. Make arrangements for an ambulance to transport him. We also need a wheelchair, the sturdier the better. Narrowing her eyes, one of the nurses jabbed a finger at Hinata's chest. Illegal quirk use is no laughing matter, young man, especially on a pro hero. Simmer down, young lady, Recovery Girl said, wrapping the nurse's ankle with the cane. I am in complete control of myself. Take note, sometimes taking small, controlled risks is better for the health of the patient. I'll be accompanying Midoriya to the dance recital to make sure that he comes back alive. I have known this young man for years, which means that I know that nothing could stop him from doing something for someone he loves. But he just woke up from a coma. I'm aware of that, but having secure, supervised transportation to a dance recital is safer than the inevitable escape plan he's got simmering in his mind, Recovery Girl said, waving her hand dismissively. Now get to it, the recital is happening as we speak. Without the pressing need to get to Aries' recital, Izuku found himself able to relax slightly. He trusted Recovery Girl to take care of everything, and ironically enough he suddenly felt incredibly tired. He let the sounds of his upcoming departure wash over him, his eyes lazily scanning the room. Almost as an afterthought, he added, Uraraka and Hinata are coming with me. Fine. But if you reopen your wound I'm petitioning to find a way to completely restrain you, the tiny woman threatened. Izuku found himself waking up a bit more when the time came to transfer him into the wheelchair they found for him. He did his best not to blush at the feeling of Uraraka's hands on his arm, floating him into the wheelchair without jostling him too much. Fro. They're a team of EMTs that looked vaguely familiar loaded Izuku into an ambulance and they were on their way. He was seconds from dozing off in the ambulance when Hinata scooted into his line of sight. Are you really okay, Mr. Midoriya? Involuntarily wrinkling his nose, Izuku said, Mr. Midoriya? You can't call me Deku, but Mr. Midoriya is just painful. Call me Izuku. Sure, Izuku, the boy squeaked. But, are you okay? Smiling at the boy, Izuku nodded. I'm just fine, Hinata, and you'll be just fine too. Furrowing his brow, Hinata looked like he wanted to ask something, but the ambulance slowed to a stop before he could formulate it. Izuku grit his teeth as people positioned themselves around him to float him and his wheelchair out of the ambulance. It was remarkable how little he'd been jostled, but despite the pain meds, searing pain ripped through his abdomen at every movement. Maybe he had fallen asleep in the ambulance if his pain meds had worn off this much. It was decent motivation for Izuku to move as little as possible. The pain was forgotten, however, as Izuku was pushed towards the elementary school that was hosting Aries' dance recital. A nervousness and anticipation swam through his stomach as he was pushed through the school. He could hear some pop music fading out as they approached the door to the auditorium. A confusing mix of emotions was filtering through Izuku as Hinata pushed the door open, just in time for a familiar song to start playing. He knew those opening chords. He'd heard them 1,000 times in the past few months, promptly followed by him being shoved out of Aries' room, because she insisted that he couldn't see her practice, or it would ruin the surprise. Now he understood. A solitary figure stepped out onto the stage, her movements graceful but hesitant. Izuku sat in his wheelchair, just past the doorway, but he didn't care about the dirty looks or whispers that they were being rude. He could only look at Eri. She looked ephemeral in her tutu that was almost the same color as her hair. The spotlight made her look even more so, and Izuku felt pride welling in his chest as he watched her gain more and more confidence as the dance went on. She was transcendent, and that was definitely not the pain meds talking. Even though her movements were graceful and fluid, Izuku could see that she was sad. She wilted a bit more every time she looked out at the front row, where he'd told her he would be sitting. All too soon, however, the music drew to a close and Eri was curtsying, head down. A smattering of applause sounded throughout the auditorium, and the host of police officers and pro-heroes in the front were making sure to clap extra loudly. Clapping was probably not advisable, but Izuku needed to let her know that he was there. Without thinking, Izuku called, "You did it, Eri." It wasn't very loud, especially by the police station standards, but it was clear that Eri heard. Snapping up from her curtsy, Eri's eyes scanned the audience with hesitant hope. When her eyes met his, all of the light and joy she discovered after leaving the Hasaikai was reflected in that single smile. "Dadku," she called, scrambling to get off of the stage. The entire audience watched Eri sprint to the back of the auditorium to where Izuku sat. Recovery Girl put herself in the path to intercept Eri. "You have to be careful, we can't hug Izuku yet," she warned the child. "I understand," Eri said before pressing forward to stand next to Izuku's wheelchair. "Are you really okay, Dadku?" "I'm fine," Izuku promised. "I was going to bring flowers for you, but I told you I would make it to your recital." She hesitantly reached out her hand towards his, but she pulled back slightly like she was afraid to hurt him. Instead, Izuku reached out slightly and took her hand in his. "I'm okay, Eri, there's no need to cry." Sniffling through her tears, she said, "You're crying too, and you and Mom are the ones that taught me that tears can be happy." Sure enough, there were tears coursing down Izuku's cheeks. "When did that happen?" "You cried through the entire dance," Recovery Girl said, patting his cheek. "But never fear, you definitely haven't cried as much as your mother." "What?" Izuku looked up from Eri to where his mother was standing in the aisle in front of him, crying more than should be physically possible. "Izuku," she wailed. "Hi Mom." Kit's corner. Tamura sat on the couch, completely engrossed in his latest video game. He felt agitated, or more accurately, he felt irritated, and he couldn't pinpoint why. He had big plans in the works, and Sensei kept saying that the time to strike was coming. Things were working out well for him, so why did he feel like tearing someone's throat out? From where he was cleaning, Kurogiri said conversationally, "There's been an update on Midoriya's condition." In his surprise, Tamura accidentally put all of his fingers onto the controller. Cursing as it crumbled to dust into his lap, he quickly shoved it away, as if to hide the evidence. "What, is he dead?" "No, he actually woke up yesterday," Kurogiri said. "Do you want to continue trying to find who it was that shot him?" "There's no sense in changing objectives," Tamura said, standing abruptly. "I have a new plan to work on, so I can't have any interruptions." Stalking out of the room, Tamura made a beeline for his bedroom, making sure to slam the door behind him. Deliberating a moment, he pulled out his phone for some research. It was probably best to avoid the actual visiting hours. Midoriya was no doubt constantly swarmed by heroes and police officers, annoyingly so. He didn't feel like causing a scene at the hospital, not with so many plans in the works. No, it would be best to be discreet. He could wait until tonight. After all, it would give him some time to perform some reconnaissance in the interim. That was how several hours later found him perched on the ledge of the hospital, just outside of Midoriya's room, bored out of his mind. He hated this plan, but he needed to time this correctly. His little entourage was gone, but he needed to make sure that a doctor wasn't going to come in and raise an alarm. Finally, the doctor came in and took Midoriya's vitals. Tamura found himself agitatedly tapping on the tree while the old man took his sweet time. He would not go in and kill the man because of his annoyance. Midoriya would be insufferable if he did that. Finally, the doctor said a few last words before leaving the room. It took Tamura a few moments to shimmy across the ledge to the window. It was a standard window with a simple lock. It was just a matter of dissolving the lock without falling off the ledge. He barely managed to do so and wrenched the window open without plummeting to his death, so he was less than impressed by Midoriya's reception. As soon as his feet had made solid contact with the floor, a water cup hit him in the head. Irritated, Tamura made eye contact with an agitated Midoriya. Aren't you supposed to be almost dead or something? Was that really necessary? He hissed. What are you doing here? Midoriya demanded in a whisper. Do you know what would happen if you got caught, or? Calm down, Tamura said, cutting the boy off. You should feel lucky that I even took the time to think about visiting you. I mean, it's good to see you, but... Before Midoriya could continue his complaint, they were interrupted by the nearly deafening sound of the ceiling vent grate hitting the floor. Neither of them could react before Twice's head poked out of the vent. Sweet, I found the right room this time. What are you doing here, Handman? Oh, hi Twice, Izuku said faintly, looking a bit sick. You decided to visit too? Of course I did. I would never visit someone like you. Tamura felt his eye twitching from aggravation when a rustling came from the doorway. A large potted tree appeared, shuffling forward. Ficus delivery. Lizard Man came to crash the party. Twice announced. Sure enough, Spinner appeared once he set the tree on the ground. It's good to hear that you haven't performed your last act of heroism, Midoriya. Stain would be proud. Thanks? Cowards, Dobby said, strolling in through the doorway. Real men don't need schemes or disguises. Did you legitimately just walk into the hospital without anyone stopping you? Izuku demanded. Yes, I did. Why haven't you been throwing things at the rest of them? Tamura whined. I'm out of cups. The group clustered around Izuku and informed him of what had gone on while he was comatose. Izuku managed to relax marginally when a voice boomed from the doorway. What's going on in here? Petrified, Izuku could barely bring himself to look at the doorway where his doctor stood. The older man looked furious, arms crossed. You all started without me? What? Who are you, old man? Izuku's mind raced with ways he could explain this to his doctor when the man started to melt. However, it was a familiar sight to Izuku, especially as his face melted away to reveal bright golden eyes and a manic grin. There was something comforting about having the majority of his poker buddies there with him, despite the strange, illegal, circumstances surrounding it. Before long though, Izuku ripped his eyes away from everyone, a blush spreading over his face. Toga, clothes. Oh, right. Shortly after the scramble to find Toga some clothes, a black portal opened in the corner of the room. Kurogiri strolled through with Magna in tow, holding a plate of cookies. We could have all come together, you know. Chapter 46. You've made good progress, Midoriya. But remember, if you overdo it even a little bit, you're going to be stuck here all over again, Izuku's new doctor said, taking off his gloves. The previous doctor was alive after his visit from Toga, but he decided to take an extended vacation after he'd suffered a nervous breakdown. Does that mean I get to go home? And start work again? Izuku asked, excitement coursing through him. It means you can go home and start doing paperwork again, Dr. Fujino said, staring Izuku down emphatically. You are better than you were, Midoriya, but you're not healthy. You have a medical background, so you should know how serious your wound is. We still can't risk using any sort of healing quirk on you because your body is barely operating as it is. One wrong move and you're back in here with me, all day every day. I'll be the model patient, Izuku promised. I don't believe you, but you're going to give the nurses an aneurysm if they find you trying to stand by yourself again. I know you're a smart kid, but remind me, what are you allowed to do in your current state? Sighing, Izuku recited, I can move from my bed to the wheelchair with assistance, and I can push myself slowly for short distances. And what can't you do? Literally anything else physically exerting. Good. I don't trust you, but I do trust your mother to minimize the number of stupid risks that you take, Dr. Fujino said, staring at him over his glasses. Feeling more than a twinge of guile, Izuku bowed his head. I promise I'll try to be a good patient for her. I've already put her through enough. And Izuku meant those words when he said them. He truly did. but intentions and practice are two very different things. Inko was more than happy to have her son home. She had been preparing for his return home for the duration of his rehabilitation, but nothing could have prepared him for the challenges that caring for a wounded Izuku would pose. It wasn't that his wound was complicated, or that he needed medication periodically. No, those were things that Midoriya Inko could handle. What she couldn't have prepared herself for was the constant threat that her son posed to his own well-being. He'd always been a threat to himself to a degree, always in the name of saving someone else. While her baby was definitely less capable of saving others, he was just as selfless as ever. Every thoughtless move he made was a danger to him. If Eri couldn't find her favorite pencil, Izuku raced through the house in his wheelchair to look for it. Inko dropped something? Izuku nearly lunged out of his wheelchair to catch it. As much as she'd love to, Inko just couldn't handle being his full-time caretaker anymore. She claimed that work needed her back next week, but frankly her nerves just couldn't take it. So here she was, tasking Shoto with making sure that Izuku stayed alive while she paid someone a visit. She winced when she heard the telltale sounds of an approaching wheelchair. Who was it you're going to visit again? Smiling faintly, Inko turned to her son. Oh, just a coworker who's feeling a little under the weather. Inko could have sworn she saw a gleam in Izuku's eye, but it was gone before she could decipher it. Right, I forgot. I also forgot to ask you, can Hinata come over to watch Takane's interview? Of course, sweetie, Inko said. She genuinely liked the boy, but he was also one more person with a vested interest in making sure Izuku didn't do anything to further injure himself. Thanks, Mom. Izuku said, wheeling away. Inko watched him for a few extra moments, partially out of fondness, but partially to make sure he didn't do anything reckless on the way to the living room. She'd found that a bored Izuku was a dangerous Izuku. Once she'd made it out of the house, Inko bustled to the police station. It was as lively a place as ever. In the back, Saito was yelling about something while Mori complained about something else. Watanabe was at the front desk, but when he saw her he stood abruptly, manila folders cascading from his desk. Not paying attention to them, he asked, "Is everything okay, Mrs. Midoriya?" Midoriya? Came several shouts from the back. Yes and no, Inko said nervously. I was hoping to talk to Detective Tsukauchi. Right away, ma'am. As Inko passed through the back, several people called out to her, asking if Izuku was okay. Before she could respond, though, Detective Kimura hushed them all, hissing that they would find out shortly. Inko felt frazzled as Watanabe led her back to Naomasa's office. After a timid knock on the door, the man opened it before the detective had responded. The detective looked confused when he saw Watanabe, covering the receiver of his phone. Watanabe, I'm on an important call. Mrs. Midoriya has an urgent matter, detective. Before Inko could refute the claim, the alarmed detective was already hanging up, saying, I'll call you later, Torino. Something came up. Impossibly, Inko felt even more anxious than she'd been feeling the last few weeks. You didn't have to hang up for me, I really can wait. Looking at her seriously, Naomasa said, It may not be that someone is dying, but I know you well enough to know that you wouldn't be here with that look on your face if it wasn't something important. Now what's going on? Twisting her hands, Inko carefully sat in one of the chairs facing the detective's desk. I know we agreed that Izuku would come back to work the Monday after next, but I don't know if I can last that long. He's all over the place, and he's always doing things that could hurt him even worse. At least if he was here, there would be more people to watch him, keep him from doing anything too reckless. Is he okay? Naomasa asked, forehead creasing in concern. I hope so. He's trying to be as active and helpful as he can be, but it's only making him hurt himself more. I can't keep up with him, and at this rate I'm afraid that something will happen without me noticing. Covering one of the mother's trembling hands with his own, Tsukauchi gave it a gentle pat. We'll help you keep him safe from himself, Inko. Meanwhile, back at the Midoriya residence, Izuku answered the door. Upon opening it, his face brightened. Hinata, You made it. The timid boy nodded. Since I haven't tried to run away or anything, Detective Kimura lets me go out as long as I ask permission and tell her when I get there. After Hinata had stopped fleeing police custody, they'd been quick to track down his family. However, after they made it clear that they wanted nothing to do with him or his quirk, Detective Kimura had made it clear that they no longer had any connection to him, just before she took him in. It wasn't an easy transition, but Izuku was thrilled to find Hinata more confident and happy every time he saw the boy. He had to admit, though, it was still a jarring arrangement to him. These decisions had happened in the period where he was always drugged up, and it was such an unlikely combination that his mind hadn't fully grasped it yet. Well, it's good to see you. Come in, come in. Why don't you push my wheelchair into the living room so I'm not accused of overexerting myself? Thanks. It wasn't until Izuku was situated in the living room between the laconic Shoto and the timid Hinata that he realized that he was in what was quite possibly the most quiet company that he could have found. Alone with Hinata, he could easily coerce the boy into sharing his mind. Alone with Shoto, he could pester his brother into some inane debate or other. However, both of his companions had intense social awkward habits, and in this moment, their social awkwardness was only feeding that of the other. It was a vicious loop that Izuku himself had fallen into on a number of occasions, but it hadn't been an issue with Shoto or Hinata since the very beginning of knowing them. Izuku was spared trying to break the awkward silence because as soon as the interview began, the stilted small talk died completely the second the newscaster flashed back on the screen. Today we're talking to the man of the hour, Officer Takane say. It's a name we all know well these days. Who else can say that they've saved the life of none other than All Might, top hero of not just the nation, but the world? Officer Takane, welcome. Awkwardly shifting in his seat was none other than Officer Takane. His uniform was pristine, although his smile looked a bit strained. This had been a genius move on the part of Detective Tsukauchi. In the time that no one knew whether Izuku was going to live or die, word had gotten out that someone had taken a bullet for All Might. The name, Deku, had been thrown around, but outside of select circles, the name was little more than an urban legend, just as Izuku had always intended. People that swore they knew something about Deku were rarely believed, and he was largely treated as a sort of boogeyman. But once the story of an ordinary person saving All Might got out, the media went wild for it. When the press called, hounding Tsukauchi for the full story, he'd been on his way to check in on the wounded Takane. Inspiration driven by his need to keep Deku a secret struck, and thus Takane became the champion of the people. Or at least that was how it was explained to Izuku. Thanks for having me, Takane said, finally settling into the chair. His smile was no longer strained, instead showcasing the very smile that the public adored. It was that exact smile that had gotten Takane onto a number of most attractive hero lists despite the fact that he was a police officer, not a hero. Officer Takane, thank you for being here today. You've done so many interviews that our station feared you wouldn't see the point in doing one more, the news anchor said, flipping her hair over her shoulder. As a police officer, I'm always happy to talk to the public, Takane said, doing a marvelous job of politely ignoring her obvious flirting. Especially when it comes to matters of public safety. Although I regret to say that I'm not very qualified to advise the public, there are many officers that are more experienced than myself. I was more than thrilled to come on today's show to talk about the importance of having up-to-date carbon monoxide alarms. Carbon monoxide? Oh. Of course, the reason we asked you to come on our show, the host said, slightly flushed at her slip. And I'm sure you have a lot to say on the subject. But before we get to that, Officer Takane, the public is dying to know. Have you had any contact with All Might since that fateful day? All Might has been kind enough to reach out to myself and all of the other officers that were there that fateful day, he said, his smile turning strained. But back to carbon monoxide alarms. Izuku's mind drifted as Takane completely dominated the conversation with the dangers of carbon monoxide, despite the frustration of the news anchor. Almost without thinking, his hand drifted to his gunshot wound. It was still tender, but at this point he adamantly refused to take pain medications, and Recovery Girl was happy with that, hoping that the pain he experienced from literally every movement would be enough to make Izuku rethink any rash decisions. It hadn't helped much, but it was something. All Might had attempted to see Izuku every single day since the incident, or so he was told. A number of people had stopped the hero, not the least of which was Detective Tsukauchi. Years ago, the thought of his hero wanting to talk to him would have made Izuku jump up and down gleefully, but now it made him feel empty. It was also just one more endlessly frustrating thing that Izuku had to trust the word of others on. Being unconscious for so long was a nightmare for him, especially when so much went on while he was out. On top of that, he'd always preferred collecting his own information, even before he'd made a career of it. Living off of hearsay and doctored stories was enough to drive him crazy. He snapped out of his train of thought long enough to half-heartedly discuss the interview with Hinata and Shoto before bidding farewell to the younger and allowing the older to push his wheelchair into Izuku's bedroom. When he'd asked to be pushed into his room, Izuku had done so with the intent to work on some quirk analysis, but once he got there, he couldn't seem to bring himself to do so. Instead, all he could bring himself to do was stare at the wall. As much as he pretended to be simply happy to be alive, when Izuku was alone, he couldn't keep up the facade that everything was okay. He was in pain and exhausted, and terrified that he would never heal correctly. He knew he was the worst patient, but trying to help in whatever ways he could was the only thing that made him slightly like his old self, in spite of the strain he knew he was putting on his body. The longer he stared at the wall, the farther he sank into his toxic thoughts. Feelings of uselessness and frustration were at the forefront, but too many emotions to count simmered beneath the surface. Just as he was about to be consumed, though, his phone rang. Startled, Izuku didn't even look at who was calling before he answered. Hello? Detective Midoriya, a warm, familiar voice said. You're needed back at work. Kit's corner. Remember people, Midoriya is coming back to work on Monday, but he's still severely injured, Kimura called, watching as officers rushed around, furiously preparing for Izuku's arrival. He will be permitted to work with paperwork, and paperwork only. On top of that, Detective Midoriya will not be permitted access to any of our current cases that would interest him. Give him parking tickets, give him noise complaints, but do not let him see the banana smuggling case, the tofu case, or anything even vaguely related to children. Got that, Mori? Grumbling as he sorted through an obscenely high stack of files, Mori said, what about the Yamamoto case? As one, the police station turned on him. Of course, not the Yamamoto case. It would practically be asking Midoriya to go looking on his own. Give that folder to Watanabe to put in the absolutely forbidden filing cabinet. The stricken receptionist looked up from the cabinet he had been thoroughly wrapping with caution tape. We missed one? I already went through 3 rolls of caution tape and we were already running low. I'm going to have to cut through this if we're going to add another file. Who told you to put that much caution tape on there? Kimura asked, arching an eyebrow. Saito claimed it was absolutely necessary if we want to keep Midoriya out. Saito, what did I say about? Guys. They did it. Sasaki yelled, racing into the room, brandishing something wildly. They were moving enough that no one could make out what it was in her hands though. What? What are those? The guys a few stations over were concerned about Midoriya, so they got these babies specially made, Sasaki said, finally stilling her hands to show 2 yellow metal contraptions. Are those what I think they are? Tamakawa breathed. Sasaki nodded. Wheelchair boots. We can make Midoriya park wherever we need to. Bless them. I might have to make them cookies. The group celebrated a bit longer until the din was interrupted by the sharp sound of a door closing. What's going on in here? What's this mess? Oh, Detective Tsukauchi, Soma said with a cheery wave. We were just preparing the station for Midoriya's return. Naomasa considered a moment before slowly nodding. Carry on. Chapter 47. Chapter 47. When the time came for Izuku to come back to work, he felt ready. He'd spent enough time laid up in bed doing nothing but paperwork. It was time for action. His excitement for work was significantly dampened by the fact that Eri and his mom wouldn't let him wheel himself to work. They were afraid he might strain himself or reopen his wound if left to his own devices. But I'm fine, he had insisted when they started pushing him out the door. The doctor said that I should start trying to push myself more so I can build my strength back up. I don't think this is what he meant, Eri said, crossing her arms. We need to know you make it safely, Inko added. Just let us do this to help you. So he had let them push him the entire way to the police station. If you had asked Izuku, he would have said that he would have much preferred pushing himself, and he definitely would not have admitted that he was actually grateful that his arms weren't tired to start his workday, and there was no way he would admit to anyone that each and every bump they hit on the way there made his wound throb. No, instead Izuku pretended everything was fine and thought about nothing but all the good he could do now that he was back at work. The entirety of the police department was waiting for Izuku when they arrived. Izuku felt tears sting his eyes at the sight of coworkers, no, his family, waiting for his arrival. It was embarrassing, but at the same time it warmed his heart to see. If they hadn't been fighting to see him in the hospital, it would have been overwhelming to have so many people vying for his attention. They truly gave him the hero's welcome. Inside there were balloons, streamers, and confetti that led to his office. It was almost definitely a fire hazard, and it appeared that there had been a sale on bachelorette party decorations given the suggestive shapes on the decor. It was completely Saito's doing, based on the way she cackled when she spotted his furious blush. To make things even worse, Watanabe was attempting to finish the paperwork to process a recent arrest, but he was too flustered because of the inappropriate comments the handcuffed man was making. Clean this up, it's completely unprofessional, Naomasa said disapprovingly. Midoriya, to your office and we'll discuss your current workload. Izuku halted, tasteless decorations forgotten. My current workload? I'm coming back to duty. What do you mean my current workload? Many of the officers traded looks before Sasaki hesitantly said, Little Midoriya, you're still a long ways from being completely recovered. You can't return to your full duties. What are you talking about? Of course I'm fine. I was cleared to work. You were cleared for desk work, Naomasa said sternly. We have some cases that we would like a consult on, as well as a number of requests for quirk analysis from police stations across the country. We refuse to put your physical well-being at risk because you are impatient. That's an order, detective. Biting back his frustration, Izuku nodded sharply. It sounds like I have plenty to do. Apparently the look on his face was enough to dissuade his colleagues from attempting to push the wheelchair for him because they just watched while he rolled on into his office. Someone had had the foresight to take away his desk chair and move his desk to allow easy access, but he was distracted by the mounds of paperwork on his desk. It was truly a formidable amount. They clearly wanted him stuck in his office, even though he felt perfectly capable of his normal amount of police work. He made it through about half of the paperwork when he heard something of interest out in the main area. A couple of the officers were speaking in hushed tones, almost definitely in an effort to keep him from hearing, but he'd spent enough time undercover that overhearing things like that was practically second nature. Someone said something along the lines of, but how are we going to get the children out? That caught Izuku's attention. As quietly as he could, he wheeled his chair forward to hear even better. They were so intent in the conversation that they didn't notice him slowly wheel into the room. He had just joined the cluster of officers as Mori said, well, if we can't bargain with them and storming the place is out of the question, what other options do we have? You could send someone in undercover, Izuku said in a whisper. That wouldn't work. No one here has the skills to pull it off. Yeah, especially since Deku is out of commission. We can request aid from one of the other police stations around, Nakamura offered. Just make sure Station 7 doesn't find out, Saito spat. That officer Furutani will just say that our station relies on Midoriya too much. That's because we do, Tamakawa pointed out. No you don't, Izuku scoffed. Yeah, Saito said, listen to little Midoriya. It took everyone a few seconds to process the conversation before the whole host of officers rounded on him, all with various levels of disapproval on their faces. It was only a matter of seconds before he had a police escort to his office. He thought that that would be the end of it, but before he knew it, he was sitting at his desk with a boot on his wheelchair, the kind of boots they used on people who had severe parking violations. Where did they even get a boot for a wheelchair? It also apparently anchored him to the floor so he couldn't budge his wheelchair. However, he exerted what strength and body weight he possessed, not that he tried to do anything like that, of course. The more he looked around, the more the amount of precautions the police station were taking to keep him safe irked him. The wheelchair boot was not only unexpected, but it was offensive, and it reeked of UA's engineering department. Of course Naomasa would call in a favor with Nezu for something like this. Little did Izuku know that there was a new committee at UA devoted to finding ways to keep him from an untimely demise. However, the most insulting thing of all stared him in the face the longer he was in his office. Someone had put a pool noodle over Stain's sword where it was mounted on the wall. It was mounted over the doorway where it would draw minimal attention in an effort to keep Deku under wraps, but have the sword available should it be necessary. That said, he couldn't even get the sword off of the wall without standing up, which was absolutely forbidden outside of physical therapy. At that point, it was baby-proofing, plain and simple. Izuku knew how everyone in the station felt about him being back at work. It was too early, he shouldn't be back yet, etc. They were excited to see him back, definitely, but they acted as glorified babysitters, not colleagues. Normally Izuku would have shrugged it off and taken care of the work he had in front of him. The paperwork and quirk evaluations were tedious, yes, but at least he wasn't cooped up in his house, or even worse, the hospital. But even though he tried to rationalize, he couldn't deny he was angry. Even more than that, though, Izuku felt petty, so he abused his knowledge of quirks and colleagues. Besides, there were certain things that he had always wanted to test, but he hadn't been willing to cause discomfort to his fellow officers. Now was his time. To begin, Izuku wanted to figure out Saito's full capabilities, at least just how much she could hear. Obviously with her enhanced senses there were a number of tests that he would love to conduct, but for now he would have to content himself with testing her hearing. Izuku was specifically interested in her range of hearing for frequencies that were above the normal range of human hearing. Obviously she could hear things from a greater distance than others could, but this was previously unexplored territory, at least for Izuku. He couldn't just play high frequencies from his office, or it would be clear that he was the source of the sound. However, with a little bit of effort, his computer was connected to the intercom system that they had but rarely used in the station. It was mostly for Watanabe to announce emergency calls to everyone. Izuku started the frequencies at levels high enough that there was almost no chance of Saito hearing them. It was better to start too high and work his way down. He started at roughly 300 kHz, the level that the greater waxmoth could hear. From there Izuku worked his way down until he noticed Saito grimace a bit. Perfect. He played the frequency until Saito turned sharply to Sasaki and asked, "What's that noise? Is Mori breathing too heavily again?" Sasaki asked without looking up from her paperwork. "No, that high-pitched, and now it's gone," Saito said, throwing her hands in the air. But that was only the beginning. Izuku had had years to come up with plans of this nature, and he was going to take advantage of it. Kit's Corner. Naomasa surveyed the wreckage of what had once been a functioning station. He knew that Midoriya wouldn't like the limited duty, but he hadn't thought that it would be this bad. The wretched bachelorette party decorations were only half taken down, as Saito stopped what she was doing every few minutes to yell about some high-pitched noise that no one else could hear. Occasionally said outbursts from Saito startled Sasaki enough that she flapped her wings hard enough to disrupt the papers on Mori's desk, which brought about yet another argument between the officers like they'd been having since Izuku had been sent back to his desk. And that was just what Naomasa could see from where he was sitting at his desk. There was a series of crashes and shouting that he didn't want to know the source of. With a bone-weary sigh, Naomasa picked up his phone, dialing the number he hadn't thought he'd need so soon. UA High School, Principal Nezu speaking. It's Tsukauchi. Ah, detective, I was wondering when I would be hearing from you. It appears that I have underestimated the ability of an entire police station to keep a single wounded teenager under control, Naomasa said. To be fair, we have known from the beginning that Midoriya is an exception to most things. What can our school do to help you in your efforts to save the young detective from himself? At this point, all we can do is to find something to keep him busy and make him feel productive. I'm at a loss here, but if you have any ideas, it will be greatly appreciated. I have just the thing in mind, detective, Nezu said, and the smile in his voice was a little terrifying. However, it was sure to keep Midoriya occupied and alive. Meanwhile, the entire station breathed a sigh of relief when it was finally time for Midoriya to go home. Inko and Eri came to bring him back, and a few of the officers were near tears at the thought of respite. His departure from the station was largely uneventful until Eri pulled a sash he hadn't noticed off of the wheelchair. What's this? Can I have it? It was definitely the work of Saito. The sash was a pink satin with glittery letters that proclaimed a less than appropriate saying. No, Eri, no, you can't have it, Izuku said quickly. Why not? Izuku looked to his mother, but she simply shook her head, clearly showing that this was his problem, and his alone. Because, it's mine. Chapter 48. Izuku scrutinized the detective in front of him before asking, so Uwa reached out to you about this assignment, not the other way around? That is correct. Given your quirk, I would have assumed that you were a better liar than this, Naomasa. Apparently I am to everyone but you, Izuku. You're on a course to kill yourself and consequently your mother. UA has an assignment that will keep you occupied in a safe way, and if you do a good job of this, it may turn into a larger partnership that will create a more cohesive cooperation between the future's heroes and police officers. No pressure, Izuku muttered. We both know you're excited about the opportunity. You just don't want to admit that you need to physically slow down, Tsukauchi said. And I know about the pedagogy courses you took a few summers ago when you were bored. I don't see how that works as evidence. You don't have to be excited about it, Midoriya, but it is an order. You can either accept the assignment, or go on bed rest. We both know what you're going to choose, so you'll be going to UA immediately to discuss what exactly you'll be going over. Tsukauchi stood, gesturing for Izuku to leave his office. After your nonsense yesterday, no one wanted to volunteer to drive you, so you'll be riding with Mori. Yes, detective, Izuku grumbled. His antics had apparently done more damage than he'd thought, because Naomasa had a steely look in his eyes that was reserved for when he had done something extraordinarily stupid. He wheeled himself to the front door with a bitter look on his face, although his mind was working overtime. He'd been given a brief description of the assignment, but Izuku knew that Nezu almost definitely had an ulterior motive, and he'd likely been cooking this plan up for a while. So, although it wasn't ideal, Izuku knew resistance was futile. Mori waited outside with the van that the station had recently added to their fleet of vehicles. Apparently Tsukauchi had justified the purchase by arguing that it would be useful in the apprehension of people whose quirks made them too large for normal vehicles, but everyone knew it was to reduce the risk of Izuku reopening his injury. Besides, Mori had been claiming that he needed a vehicle to do parking duty with when he wasn't on missions. Mori was silent as he helped Izuku into the van, and Izuku assumed that it would be similarly quiet on the car ride. However, about halfway through the drive, the police officer sighed. Can you, try not to die for at least a few days? Anyone else would love the opportunity to take a break for a while, maybe catch up on some sleep, but no, Lil Midoriya can't stop himself. If you're going to bleed out, at least do it quickly and get it over with. Stop torturing everyone around you. Shocked, Izuku stared at the officer as he drove. After a few beats, he hesitantly said, I'll try, I guess. Pulling up to the main gate of UA, Mori put the van in park. I don't really care, you're their problem now. A handful of teachers were waiting at the gate for him. It must have been their prep period. Present Mike was the first person to greet him at the door of the van, smile wide. An ectoplasm was directly behind Mike, while another was chatting with Midnight. Mori had barely let Izuku out of the van before he drove off, muttering something about going to get boba. Left in the care of UA's finest, Izuku was pushed towards Nezu's office amidst some small talk. It was nice to see the teachers, but Izuku was getting more than a little impatient to find out what Nezu had in store for him. The principal was waiting for him, just as expected. Young Midoriya, what a pleasure it is to have you in our school once again. I can't tell you how delighted we were to find out that you had accepted our humble offer. You say that as if I had any choice in the matter, Izuku said, raising an eyebrow. We always have choices, it's merely a matter of what we do with them, but you already know that. So why am I here? I've already gotten the job description you gave Tsukauchi, but I want to hear from you why I'm here. Nezu templed his fingers, paused. Well, detective, you have proved to be an exceptional member of the police force. In that time I'm sure that you've been exposed to the inadequacies of collaboration between our country's heroes and our police force. I'm listening. You of all people are more than aware of the public perception of our police. Quite frankly, the police are largely seen as the butt of a joke, rather than the organization that is vital to keeping modern society in check. The public has no idea how instrumental the police are to keeping the peace, and heroes largely have no idea either. Izuku scrutinized his furry companion. I do know all of this, so what? I want to change this. In these troubled times we need vigilance from everyone, and we need a better partnership between the police force and the Hero Commission if we're going to protect our citizens the way we should. Narrowing his eyes, Izuku said, makes sense, but there's still something you're not telling me. Chuckling, the principal held up his paws. I should have known that you wouldn't accept a simple answer. To be frank, Midoriya, you have a gift for shaking things up. Our current hero students are some of our strongest yet, they've faced much adversity. However, there are some misconceptions they need to face head-on if they're going to be the best heroes they could be. And how exactly am I supposed to accomplish that? Detective Midoriya, I'm fairly certain that your mere presence will lead them to change. And that's why I want you to teach them. Izuku snorted. Right, because hero students are going to be so eager to listen to the quirkless cop. In case you haven't noticed, everything about me is a joke to them. You've studied the fundamentals of rhetoric, no? I'm sure that being the youngest detective in history will lend you a certain ethos. Regardless, you're stuck here teaching for the time being. I don't think you're capable of not putting your all into an assignment. Izuku wanted to grumble, but he also knew that Nezu was right. Where do I start? That conversation was what led to Izuku sitting among a number of UA's finest teachers, discussing the logistics of his assignment. We don't have time to waste, Vlad King said, banging a fist on the table. My students need experience, not a workshop on how to make nice with the police. But your students will be working with the police, correct? Izuku said as pleasantly as he could muster. Waving his hand, the hero said, yes, yes, the police are valuable support for heroes, but there's no reason to take away vital class time. Graduation is coming, and my students need to be prepared for the real world. The police are a completely separate organization from the Hero Association. While there is frequently collaboration between the police and heroes, we work independently, not as your support. Teaching your students to work with the police would not only help protect citizens more effectively, but it could save their lives as well. Up to that point, Izuku had stalwartly avoided looking at All Might. He didn't even think about letting his eyes stray in the direction of the man, but he couldn't miss the way the hero jumped at Izuku's comment, and a slightly twisted part of him was glad of the guilt he saw on the number one hero's face. Luckily, Nezu came to Izuku's rescue. In his terrifyingly cheerful way, the principal said, "This isn't merely a suggestion. I believe that implementing a program such as this will not only help us to keep the population safer, but will revolutionize hero-police collaboration. Midoriya will start with my class, Aizawa said, his first addition to the conversation. My class has interacted with him in the past, so they might be more receptive to what he has to say. Receptive? Surely the students would be willing to listen to. No, they're not going to want to listen to me, Izuku said evenly. Everything about society leads people to ignore any police personnel, especially heroes. I may be here because of extenuating circumstances, but Nezu is attempting to address a legitimate need. In that moment, Izuku felt a newfound determination for the assignment that he'd been given. This program, if successful, would revolutionize the country as it stood, and his stubbornness wasn't worth risking such a possibility. It was clear that not all of the teachers were convinced of the importance of Izuku's presence, but they established a schedule of when he would be going to each hero class. He had mixed feelings about the assignment. He wanted to help improve the infrastructure for dealing with criminals, and he had been in the police department for long enough to know exactly why a program like this was necessary. He was also acutely aware that it was going to suck, though. If the teachers were this reserved about his presence, the hero students were going to be furious, especially if they didn't have any warning. My students are all out on a mission and likely won't be back for the rest of the day, Aizawa said, rising from his seat with the principal nestled in his scarf. Midoriya can come to my classroom tomorrow morning to announce the change in curriculum later. Excellent plan, Aizawa, the principal said, patting the scruffy teacher's face. In the meantime, we'll work on getting you the proper security clearances and whatnot, Midoriya. Izuku nodded, slowly wheeling himself behind the principal and Aizawa, his mind already buzzing with plans for the students. Kit's corner. So UA is going to keep little Midoriya occupied for the rest of the day, right? Sasaki said, her eye twitching just a bit. It seemed to be a nervous habit that had developed after Izuku decided to test the limits of their quirks. Or at least until one of us goes to pick him up, Saito confirmed. Good, because the finalists are here. Opening the door between the lobby and the main portion of the police station, Sasaki led in the 3 final applicants for the bodyguard, babysitter position. The police station had pooled their money to fund the position so that Midoriya hopefully wouldn't kill himself before he got out of the wheelchair. How are we going to tell little Midoriya about this? Nakamura asked, an eyebrow raised. I don't want to be there when he hears that we think he needs a babysitter. We don't tell him, Soma half-heartedly suggested. How good are these guys? Do we really think that they could manage not to have Midoriya notice them? No, they're not going to be that good, Izuku said. I mean, they're old enough that they have at least a little bit of an edge on little Midoriya, Saito said. They might for a while, but I would notice eventually, Izuku said, wheeling towards his office. The police station froze as everyone collectively turned to look at the detective in the wheelchair. Present Mike dropped me off, and none of you are terribly good at being discreet. I'll either take the position at UA or the bodyguard, you don't get both. The station was silent until Izuku's office door closed. After a few tense moments, Mori turned to Saito. I told you so, you owe me lunch tomorrow,